Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear guest, welcome. My name is Stefania Benaglia, I'm the head of Foreign Policy Unit, and on behalf of SEPS, I would like to thank you and welcome you to today's event, which is entitled Charting the Way Forward for EU Geoeconomic Policy from Disentangling Global Gateway to Shaping Future Directions. This event today really aims to influence the upcoming Foreign Affairs Council conclusions on Global Gateway and provide ideas for the new Commissioner for International Partnerships, Sikela, which we expect to be taking office soon. With the new Commission taking office, we are really entering the second phase of Global Gateway, while the first 3 years were devoted to strengthening the, let's say, internal governance of the strategy. The new phase will focus on scaling up the initiative and building the brand. Today we'll discuss how to do that. Today's event is co-organized together with the Global Public Policy Institute, GPPI, and is an opportunity to present the preliminary results of SEP's task force, Disentangling Global Gateway from Team Europe to the World, and GPPI's Stabilization Lab, a project funded by the German Federal Foreign Office. These initiatives well complement each other, and today we're going to discuss them both. SEP's task force on Global Gateway brought together EU officials from various institutions, almost all, development practitioners from international organizations and partner countries, SEP's researchers, as well as other experts from the civil society and private sector, to address the challenges of Team Europe's buying in and clarify how to engage with partners and enhance complementarity with other global connectivity initiatives. The key findings and the recommendations will be presented more in detail during the discussion by our experts, but I would like to share with you right now the key recommendation that Global Gateway must reconcile the dual objectives of upholding sustainable development goals and promoting EU competitiveness, objectives that can be inherently contradictory, but they need to reconcile them both to maintain the credibility and to leverage its global leverage. The center of the discussion is exactly this: how to position the EU in this dynamic between upholding SDGs and prioritizing development cooperation and enhancing competitiveness. In the second panel, where GPPI Stabilization Lab will also be presented, the discussion will zoom into how Global Gateway should better align with conflict resolution efforts, and by extension, what is the EU future role in conflict-affected areas. So thank you for taking the time, for daring the snow and joining us today in person. And without any further ado, I know that today we have an audience that is very engaged, so thank you very much for coming. We will leave as much time to the Q&A. Please prepare some ideas to share with us and also some comments. I hope we will have the time for really an exchange and a dialogue. But without any further ado, I would like to invite our keynote speaker, the Honorable MEP Anna Neumann, member of the group of the Greens and European Free Alliance, to deliver her remarks. Please, thank you.
Good morning. This works very well. Good morning, and thank you for the introduction, Stefania, and thank you all for inviting me. I have to admit, in these times, I might have brought more questions than answers, but we're just at the beginning of this legislative term, so I guess that's fine. Maybe a few more words of introduction, not because I think that I'm super important, but because it might help to understand the perspective and the different roles from which I will be somehow speaking, because I have close ties with GPPI. I have been a think tanker in my previous life, for example, working with GPPI back then on civilian CSDP, which was a hot topic some years ago, and I hope we can still make it a hot topic in these difficult times. I have worked myself in some development organizations, namely ACF. I have a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies, and I became a member of the European Parliament 5 years ago. And I'm right now the Greens coordinator in the Foreign Affairs Committee, but also have a seat in the Defense Committee, and was Vice President in the Human Rights. And I really think it is crucial that we connect, well, first of all, the work that is happening in the field with what is happening and what we are deciding here in Brussels or in other capitals in the member states. but also that we really look at foreign policy from these different aspects, so we don't neglect one or the other, but we also don't highly prioritize one over the other. The EU coined this idea of the integrated approach, which I always thought is a fantastic idea. If I look at what we're doing right now, I'm not so sure if we still live up to this idea. Why did I come here with more questions than answers? Well, first of all, we have a new commission. Yesterday, it has been somehow cleared in the committees. Hopefully next week it will be cleared in the European Parliament. And then after 6 months of keeping ourselves busy with ourselves, we can start working on these issues again. By keeping ourselves busy with ourselves, I mainly mean the European Parliament. I know that a lot of the DGs and services have been working in the meantime. Why did I also bring more questions than answers? Well, Trump is going to start mid-January. If I look at his cabinet that he's putting together, it seems as if he's trying to look like the rational one. Not sure if that makes me sleep better. Why did I also bring more questions? Because, and I said that actually in 2019, and I think we said that back in 2014, Philip. There are just so many conflicts, and the highest political level is not capable to deal with more than one or two at a time. And we already see that when I say the word Sudan. So Ukraine, okay, we got that. Middle East, yes, also because this conflict somehow plays out in our own schools, on our own streets. But Sudan, that's where it kind of already stops with our attention. And then we are all short in budget. I can't put it otherwise. We are all short in budget. We are short in budget when it comes to homeless people on our streets. We are short in budget when it comes to the situation in our schools, be it teachers, be it buildings. But we are also short in budget when it comes to how can we support the Sudanese refugees that just ended up in Chad, which is not necessarily a rich country. And all the other conflict settings at which we look. So we really have a competition, and I haven't yet talked about the big need to scale up defense, to which we somehow all agree. We had the Ministry report on preparedness and resilience. I could almost underline every word he said, but he also said it's 500 billion. And that's where, well, we all get in trouble. And to see how we can maneuver this competitive setting where one needs to somehow be prioritized or related or whatever to another, because I can't. I would like to come up with all these ideas of funds and whatever. We bring in the private sector and then we scale it up, and then for some weird reasons we find money in the budget. And I really think we have done as much as we could in this regard, and right now I'm afraid for the next 5 years we are in a situation where the euro that we spend in Syria is a euro that we can't spend in our schools. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend it in Syria, but we need to be aware of the competition in which we are maneuvering and how we communicate and how we make people understand. And how we also increase accountability for the money that we spend in each and every sector. So the questions I brought against this backdrop. What do we want is the first one. The second one is where do we go? And the third one is who's going to pay? The first one, what do we want? We're talking about EU money here, right? And about the common foreign and security and defense policy. So I looked in the treaties, Article 21. I'm going to read out a few words in that one, and then maybe you get already what I'm trying to say. The role of the European Union Common Foreign Security Policy is to maintain peace, strengthen international security, consolidate democracy and the rule of law, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, to maintain partnerships and dialogues based on mutual interests and benefits. Then I looked at the practical guidelines of Ursula von der Leyen for her second term, where in the foreign policy sections it says economic foreign policy, economic security, protecting our economy, de-risking and decoupling critical raw materials, global gateway. Am I the only one who recognizes a little gap? We addressed this gap in the hearing with Kaja Kallas, and also when asking her questions on behalf of the parliament. And we somehow also informally got certain signals from the Commission, and because this is not Chatham House, this is where I leave it, that there has been a frustration on the Commission side that often it's member states who do this kind of hard foreign policy of interests-driven, economic-driven, and then just easily leave the human rights issues to the European Union. Like, you know, we do what is in our interest and what gives us access and economic benefits, and the stuff that gets a bit tricky, we also find it important, but EU does it. And this was often also my impression when I traveled to a number of these countries, be it Egypt or Colombia, or I can name a few others, and I said, okay, dear German or French, or not to blame some, so what are we doing? Well, human rights, that the EU does it. Well, I don't think the answer should be that now also the EU stops doing it. Especially at a time where human rights defenders, peace activists tell me with the US being in a very, the best thing we can say about him is that he is unpredictable. This is where we are. So they are telling me, you are the only ones who still care and we count on you. And I would find it very difficult if now we also give up on this because we want to be part of this big economic foreign policy race, which doesn't mean that we should give up on that. Which brings me a bit to the global gateway. It's super prominent in Sikela's mission letter. I can tell you from the side of the European Parliament, we're still a bit trying to figure out what it exactly is. So we have 250 flagship projects. Okay, I got it, 250 flagships? No, I think it's 250. On the website, they say it's 250 flagship projects. I'm not sure if this is how exactly you set priorities. Then there's very little accountability in all of that to us in the parliament, and who else should it be for accountability than us in the parliament? When it comes to what we do with other funds that have a certain human rights impact assessment, that have a certain social rights, environmental rights impact assessment, this is not programmed into Global Gateway in the same way. On the other hand, I totally see the concept and the idea and the understanding of the benefit, and that brings me to the where do we go? Because what we have seen in the last, I don't even know how far we can go back, for sure, since I'm in the European Parliament, years is wherever the US mainly, but also other actors leave a gap, someone is filling it. And this someone is either Russia or China or Iran, or it could be the European Union. And this is the big challenge that we had over the last years when I look at, for example, so Mali, for a good reason, I think the French tried to reduce their footprint. The EU didn't manage to fill the gap, so Russia did. When I look at the situation in the Middle East, let's take Iraq. US reduced. EU didn't even think about filling it. It's Iran now. And we can do that for all these settings. So the general idea of saying, okay, we have a better approach with the Global Gateway where we don't come with the weird strings attached that come with Iran. I wouldn't say I think we overdo it a bit with we don't have any strings attached because we are afraid of the conditionality discussion. So I think there we overdid it a bit. But I think in general, the idea of is we have a different idea, we have a different approach to fill these gaps is a good one. I'm just not sure that without being very precise on what, so is it education, is it infrastructure, is it renewables? So being all over the place content-wise, and then also being all over the place regionally, we can really fill gaps. This is what I'm sometimes a bit concerned, which is why, especially given the budgetary situation, maybe we need to have a discussion on where do we go in a way that we really deliver. And that we don't end up in the Mali scenario where we tried a bit, but then we couldn't do enough, and then somebody else came in, and in the end that somebody else was more lucrative. And then basically we just left, and a lot of the stuff that we tried to do there was gone. So do we focus on the accession countries? I think we have to. And with Ukraine and the Ukraine facility and the peace facility, you also see if we have this focus and there's a political will and we did a joint strategy process that this is really what counts on us, budget can increase. What do we do with the neighborhood? And by the way, how big is our neighborhood? I found it quite interesting that part of the portfolio of Srica, our new commissioner for the Mediterranean, extends to including all the Gulf countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan. We can do that, but it's a promise on which, again, we have to deliver if we make it. And I'm not sure if we have the power to do that. Then comes the African continent, on which somehow we now also focus, sadly, mostly for migration issues, which I think is highly cynical. I can't put it in another way. I don't get it. For me, these are children that are starving, and I think we should help them, irrelevant whether they will pack their suitcase and come our way or not. And then we haven't even spoken about Latin America, and we need to come to a point that we prioritize prioritization and strategy making as the 26, 27, let's see how many will become part of this process, come together, do the prioritization, the strategization, and really call the shots of what we can do and what we can't do, and what member states do and what the EU does. Because we would have a huge lever if we would really act as a Team Europe. But we still don't. I remember the situation 4 or 5 years ago when Berlin started the Berlin process on Libya, while some EU member states were still supporting one side of the conflict, others were supporting the other side of the conflict, and we were having ships in the Mediterranean that were trying to stop weapon smuggling. And then Turkey said we can't even smuggle the ships. And I was sitting in the European Parliament asking Borrell, so where's our strategy on Libya? Well, he can't solve that one. And it's just one example. And there are a number of other conflicts and countries where we are still in total disarray and we simply can't afford that anymore. We can't afford it in the defense sector, where we are still co-producing and competing with each other on the defense market, just making arms companies richer. And we can't afford it anymore when it comes to development foreign policy, our budgetary tools. I don't understand why it needs 27 Ministry of Developments. Sorry. I'm sorry if I step on someone's feet here, but to me it doesn't make any sense. And it's quite interesting to see in the case of Afghanistan, where only the EU is present, and everyone is happy they are, and they channel it all. And I wouldn't go as far as saying let's close all the embassies in all the other countries. I don't think that's a wise decision, but it shows that it's actually possible, it's doable, and in this case member states are quite glad that the EU takes over this very difficult role. Brings me to who's going to pay. Crises are going up, needs are going up, the UN pledges needs are going up, our resources are going down. The second problem and that's why I was very glad for the GPPI paper, is that we can, in the domestic setting, we can program for 7 years, kind of. Because we make laws, that's us making the laws. Then we need the money for projects and programs to come with this. That's us making the projects and the programs coming with it. And then we see if it works, and then we see if we need to move one way or another. Okay, if something comes like the Russian invasion to Ukraine, it's a different thing. But in general, this is how you can make a 7-year plan with a lot of knowledge and good expertise, and it works. We can't program the world. Which is why a 7 years budgetary cycle doesn't fit the way this policy field works. And now that we're discussing the next MFF, I think this has to be one of the key learnings. If we move away from this 7 years, everything rather preset, I know we have the emergency cushion and we have the rapid response, but if you look at how much budget is there and how much budget is with everything that needs to be programmed 2-3 years in advance, it doesn't fit the setting to which we need to find answers. So I think we need to leave much more flexibility for things that we need to give flexible answers to things that are happening in the world, yet find ways to still remain accountable to the public and the European Parliament. And this is a discussion that I hope we can have in the year to come. How can we ensure flexibility with accountability? Because flexibility only is a problem, and the bigger we make the flexible part, the more we need to have this discussion. How can we still ensure accountability? And I would think in the end, because when I make the point that we need more flexible money, I understand that it would be also taken from this amount that is for the global gateway. I think it could also benefit the idea of the global gateway. Because what do we do if we start, let's take Lebanon. I think that's a very good example. So we start a solar plant project with Lebanon, and we are just building up, which is a highly political thing in Lebanon, how we get the energy out of that grid, a governance forum so that the communities around it can actually use it, though they are no longer dependent from the gasoline, which comes with a lot of strings attached, as we all know. And then we run into situations such as the Israeli attacks on Lebanon. And we can't continue with the proper global gateway 2 years planning implementation cycle. So what do? We say, okay, well, so your situation doesn't fit our project structure anymore. We are going to stop, and maybe in 5 years, when everything's stable again, we come back. Doesn't sound smart from whatever perspective you look at it. So then being more flexible, seeing maybe first we need to support this community because they take in refugees and they now have another problem than working on this power plant and discussing governance structures of this power plant, the solar plants. And then maybe we need to adapt the project in a way that it can still survive, maybe on a smaller scale. And then maybe we can save the money and continue later on. So how do we link these funding tools that actually they are more tailor-made to the situation on the ground than they are to our decision-making structures here is the second discussion that hopefully we can and we should have. So what am I saying? We need to prioritize no way around that. We need to uphold the idea of the integrated approach. So yes, we need to scale up defense, but that can't solve the whole puzzle. And I'm sorry to say, things that we said 5 or 10 years ago are not wrong just because Russia invaded Ukraine. I think they are right even more so. Third one, we need to have more flexibility with accountability. And number 4, we need to understand better how we can link this tool to make them fit to the various situations on the ground that we can't program. That would be my input so far.
Well, thank you very much. You marvelously introduced the discussion of today, touching on all the points that we're planning to touch on. So thanks for framing it from, the EU finding its place in the world externally, but reconciling the way it works internally as well. The whole issue of, which financial tools, the flexibility and accountability, which obviously is a dynamic that needs to be nailed. The integrated approach, and by the way, the integrated approach is true for defense, but beyond defense as well, because that is a mechanism where the EU needs to learn how to act 360. I have personally tons of questions for you, and I'm pretty sure the audience does as well. But unfortunately, we're running a little bit out of time, so I would invite the speakers of the next panel and the following one, perhaps to integrate a little bit the question that they might have on you, and take up this discussion in the panel discussion. But first, of course, thank you very much for framing the discussion so well. Thanks. So please allow me. And now I would like to invite to the stage our research fellow, Dr. Ceren Ergeng, to invite the next panel, to kick off the next panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is Ceren Ergenç, Research Fellow at SEP's Foreign Policy Units. I'm myself working on Chinese politics and a part of the Global Gateway Task Force. And today, in this first panel, we are going to first introduce our task force, our focus, findings a little bit with a case study on the energy. So we're going to talk about the ways to achieve the dual objectives of development and competitiveness, and that's going to exactly build on the idea of flexibility and accountability we just discussed, actually. So I'm really happy that these two will be super connected. And we will introduce mutual resilience as our policy recommendation, as you'll see soon in our report as well. And also how to achieve coordination within Team Europe and organizational reforms for the Global Gateway. And for this discussion, we are going to have Christian Dietz, our researcher at the Energy Resources and Climate Change Unit, please. And after Christian introduces our case study on energy in relation to the broader issues we address in this task force, we are going to have, if I may, Mr. Luc Bagur from DJ INTPA, the Director of Sustainable Development Policy and Coordination, please. Thank you. And Mr. George Van Manfort, the UNDP Deputy Director in Brussels, to respond to our points represented by Christian. So just a quick reminder to my fellow panelists that this discussion is not Chatham House. You'll have about 10 minutes for your interventions each, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for your contributions for hopefully a longer period of time. Thank you. So, Christian, would you like to start?
All right. Thank you and good morning. I'm sorry, my voice is a bit affected by the snowfall, I'm afraid. That was really unexpected. But yeah, happy to see that all of you made it despite the extreme weather outside. So maybe to start things off, I think this is also where the discussions in our task force started with the framing of the Global Gateway. And I hope it also touches on a few points that we just heard from the keynote. So because also for us, the first question was, what is actually Global Gateway? What is its agenda? What is it trying to achieve? And if we look back, I think then we notice that the agenda is very broad. Having started off particularly as also a geopolitical tool, as a counteroffer to the BRI initiative, we saw that there is a development over the past few years with, particularly since the Russian war against Ukraine, a stronger focus, and the following energy crisis, a stronger focus on the EU's geoeconomic security interests. When we also saw more language regarding the EU's strategic autonomy, so the interest of the EU to strengthen its strategic autonomy through the global gateway while still addressing partner countries' needs. So this was already then quite a broad agenda. And we also saw that there were very different perceptions of the global gateway over the past few years by the partner countries, where some partner countries felt, particularly by the language on the global gateway being a counteroffer to the BRI, feeling pressured to pick sides, which for some countries was now to be very difficult because they want to get investment into their country. We also saw that when the language started more to become focused on geoeconomic interests of the EU, talking about the EU's strategic autonomy, that the question particularly became prominent, what's in for the partner countries? If the EU is focusing on strengthening its supply chains, on securing raw material demand, what is in for partner countries? And so the first issue that we discussed in that regard was therefore the framing of the global gateway and what could be a more inclusive concept to put at the center of the global gateway. And in the discussions, the concept of resilience came up to focus on mutual resilience of the EU and its partner countries. And of course, then the next question is, okay, so what does that actually mean? And here I can only talk about the discussions on energy and digital. If we touch on more areas in the later discussions, then I hope also my colleagues will come in. Plus, please forgive me that I'm definitely not an expert in all those areas. So I will talk about resilience in the energy sector. The main discussions that came up around that was that the needs for the EU are quite clearly articulated. It's, as I mentioned, we also read it in several reports, in the Draghi report, the need to secure affordable, clean energy supplies, to secure the access to raw materials, but then again, what is in it for partner countries? And there, the discussions revolved around how to enable partner countries to increase their local value addition, to enhance their ability for local value chain upgrading, given local specificities, and therefore really reconcile the needs of the EU and its partner countries. For digital discussions also involved that the EU can basically make, on the one hand, hard contributions in supporting digital infrastructure, for example, submarine cables, but also really soft contributions. So to really engage there in capacity building, developing the frameworks where the EU is, has a leadership, for example, in privacy, cyber security, and digital rights, which could be used to support also partner countries. But also enable partner countries then to build up their own digital economy. And as one of the our chapter is actually called Twin Transition, we also wanted to dive deeper into what are the synergies between the two. So not thinking in silos of energy and digital, but also see how those can be reconciled to actually find synergies. For example, when we talk about the integration of renewable energies, how can we leverage their digital investments to support that? What is the common denominator of all of that is the question, how can that be financed? And I think here we see that in the Global Gateway, the private sector is supposed to play a very dominant role. In the 300 billion, I think if I'm not mistaken, 150 billion are supposed to come from the private sector. And here the discussions also with stakeholders of that, there is a case to make. There is interest in the private sector to invest, for example, in the energy sector. What they need are guarantees. But also, and this is, again, I think very important, if we talk about a global gateway, then all of those investments still have to follow or contribute to the SDGs and be embedded in that framework. And the point that I would like to make that I just lost, so I will just keep on to move on to the next point, is the other common denominator. It's the regulatory capacity building, where we said that what is very important is to not focus on just aligning with EU rules and laws and regulatory frameworks, but to actually co-develop, to make sure that those are adapted to local specificities, that they address partner countries' needs. And we also, in the EU, have to consider the external impact of our own policies on global gateway partnerships, for example, CBAM and others. I think it is important to have a comprehensive approach, to not send any kind of mixed signals, but also support really the partner countries comprehensively. And I think this is where I would leave it for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christian. And before we move on, I would like to just clarify a point that, first of all, is a way of an introduction of our task force and the upcoming reports. Energy was not our only case study. We had case studies on digital and trade and finance as well. And Mallory Schlaus, our colleague from the grid unit, was going to be here to talk about complementarity in trade policies. But unfortunately, she didn't survive the snow as good as Christian did. So she couldn't make it today. But we will try to cover trade in the Q&A session as well. And we have our colleague Scott Marcus to talk about digital case study later in the Q&A session too. So we will hopefully cover all grounds here. But here I'm going to stop and leave the word to Mr. Bogur first, if it is okay, and then we can move on to Mr. Mumford.
Okay. So thank you for the invite and the opportunity to talk about Global Gateway at a very topical moment, right at the time we have an incoming commission and a new political cycle for the next 5 years. And the mandate of the new commissioner designates Sikela when it comes to Global Gateway is rather clear. We need to take the strategy from startup to scale up. So the Global Gateway was launched now, let's say 3 years ago, in response to the global infrastructure gap. So this was the starting point. And we know that we have a huge gap in investment for reaching the SDGs. And so the objective was to support partner countries in their twin digital and green transitions. Starting point. It also consolidates a paradigm shift that we have seen over the last years, where we move from traditional model of development cooperation to win-win partnerships with partner countries. So the Global Gateway aims to strengthen both our partners' economies and Europe competitiveness. So this is the dual approach. So we need to build beneficial partnerships, and we try to foster their resilience. So how we do that? We try to have a 360-degree approach, which supports not only hard infrastructure. Hard infrastructure is important, it's at the core of the Global Gateway, but also creates an enabling environment and focus on local value creation, job growth, strategic autonomy, in line with the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And indeed, eradicating poverty remains the primary objective of EU works in development cooperation as set out in the treaty, in Article 208 of the Treaty of the European Union. But at the same time, the European Union's economic security, strategic autonomy, competitiveness, prosperity, resilience, etc., as well its capacity to promote its interests, values, norms, standards, are very, very linked to global developments. So building and diversifying mutually beneficial partnerships should result in supporting the European Union's economic security, competitiveness, prosperity, even providing EU private sector with increased opportunities in partner countries, while at the same time responding to partners' need for sustainable development. So we don't see there a contradiction. For instance, under the Global Gateway, we establish sustainable raw material partnerships with a number of countries. So we have already signed, I think, 14 critical raw material agreements with countries like Uzbekistan, DRC, Zambia, Argentina, etc. So this, with the objective to reduce the European Union dependencies on critical raw materials, and we know how critical raw material is important for our own green transition, if we want to decarbonize by 2050. Same thing for green hydrogen, by the way. And we boost, at the same time, the local value addition in partner countries. So take the example of Namibia, where we have memorandum of understanding to produce green hydrogen or to process critical raw material in Namibia rather than to process them in China, for instance. So we support industrialization in Namibia, and at the same time we secure critical raw materials and green hydrogen for our own green transition. Let me take another example, but I will look at my note to be rather precise. One of the example I like particularly is the e-mobility sector in Costa Rica. So scaling up the electrification of public transport is a key piece of Costa Rica's decarbonization strategy. So on top of the electric buses and trains, we have to invest in infrastructure, reviewing route planning, tariff, e-ticketing, digital transport control, park and ride, etc., etc. So this is a whole package. And there, Team Europe comes with the full package with the three legs, the political one, the business one, and the financial one. So on the political policy side, we provide a wide-ranging offer to help set up a sustainable multimodal mobility framework. And there, Team Europe will provide training in partnership with local authorities and universities. On the industrial side, a Portuguese bus manufacturer is partnering with a Dutch mobility company to offer a comprehensive model to electrify the bus fleet, and other private sector companies are interested to offer other infrastructure like the charging infrastructure lab or etc. And to build as well the local battery value chain. And then on the financial side, we have the European Investment Bank, the Agence Française de Développement, KfW, Portuguese and Swedish export credit agencies, the Spanish Ministry of Economy that bring financing for the project in different forms. It could be grants, loans, etc. So you see that under this Global Gateway project, we pursue one of our objectives, which is the green transition, the Green Deal, and that we support in this transition our partners. I would like to conclude by saying that Global Gateway is important, of course, in the next cycle, but we cover all the spectrum of development cooperation. So we are still present in human rights, we are still present in human development. By the way, 42% of our expenditure last year was on human development. So this shows that and this is above the target set in our legal instrument. In the legal instrument, it is 20%. So we are at the double of what was being said by the European Parliament and the Council. So we are still present in peace and security. We are still present in the whole spectrum of development cooperation, tackling fragility situation, etc., etc. So on this, I stop there, ready to respond to any question.
Thanks a lot for your intervention. Please, Mr. Mumford.
Thank you so much. And let me start also by thanking SEPS for creating this space for discussion and a reflection at a time, I think everybody mentioned, that is very critical with a new commission coming in. Global Gateway much more front and central in the policies. And maybe the one thing I'd like you to, I'll bring a few points, but the one thing I would like you to bring, in addition to what has been discussed, and Hannah, you mentioned priorities. For me, it's being more deliberate about the investments we're making. Yes, priorities are important, but with a shrinking budget, being more deliberate about where we're investing and how we're investing, I think is critical. I'll come back with a few examples to that. And partnership in that are vital, right? Because it might not be the EU investing in a certain area, but that could leverage investments that others are making through the UN. And again, I'll bring an example there. So I think I'd just like to bring that in, that we need to be more deliberate collectively. I'm not pointing fingers at the EU. I think collectively as an international community, we need to be more deliberate about what we want to achieve. So one, I mean, I already mentioned in Global Gateway, very central. We're pleased to see the evolution from, as you said, an infrastructure idea towards an idea that's trying to promote the SDGs. The 360 approach we really welcomed as a more comprehensive review on how critical investments in infrastructure, which are needed, can be complemented with important elements of socioeconomic development, thinking about what if we build that road, how do we affect on social cohesion in the communities? Right, if we build a dam or if we build a power plant, how do we deal with displacement of the population there? How do we deal with employment issues? So we really welcome the fact that sort of that 360 has come in addition. We also recognize that ODA alone will not allow us to achieve the SDGs. So the fact that we're really trying to leverage financing is absolutely vital. I don't want to go into details, but we know only 17% of the SDG goals are on track. We've pushed an additional 23 million into extreme poverty, and over 100 million people more were suffering from hunger in 2022 compared to 2019. So the trajectory is completely off. So everything we can do to really invest in development is key. For me, where it also the interesting point where some say, well, but it's all about economic development. Well, yes and no. If you look at the multi-dimensional poverty index, 2/3 of poor people actually live in middle-income countries. So yes, your country's middle income, you're still dealing with a lot of poor people. So it's not just about growth, and I think we need to keep that in mind. From us, as we said, we welcome the 360 approach. We need to accompany hard infrastructure with sustainable financing, green policies, digital public infrastructure, etc. And a lot of that work is what we as a UN system around the globe are actively involved in. And I think and when I said being more deliberate in the investment we're making, one of the challenges we see is how do we get involved in a conversation around Global Gateway flagships or whatever they are investments to make sure that we're able to leverage. Not to necessarily position ourselves as your one and only partner, because we know that's not the case, but really to make sure that in the broader spectrum of support provided to these countries, there's a consideration of how we can leverage each other. And let me bring an example here. We were meeting with the European Investment Bank a little over a week ago in Luxembourg and discussed investments that the UN had made with the government of Ecuador through the Green Climate Fund and the Green Environment or the Global Environment Facility on deforestation efforts or countering deforestation efforts, right? And this we're working with farmers, coffee farmers. We managed with a small investment to reduce deforestation. We saw productivity grow. We saw also income growth. Lavazza came in as a private sector partner, considering also the EU laws that are coming in, and is now sort of in sort of off-taking the products from Ecuador. EIB is interested in the seed to skill. How do we bring this forward? Right now we have one producer. How can we do more to support that effort? The investments you made through different ODA channels, how do we leverage that? As we were discussing this, we realized there's a Global Gateway initiative, a Team Europe initiative in Ecuador on the very same thing. Again, why were we not more deliberate? There's different timelines in all of this, but we could have been more deliberate in bringing this together and thereby achieving more with the less money that's there. So this is one of many examples where we feel Again, not to say we want a piece of the pie as a UN system to help implement, but that we say, can we think more strategically how we link these pieces together? And there's many more examples in this, but really for us to call, we understand what the EU is doing, we value what it's doing, we welcome the 360, but we'd like to be involved so that we can be more deliberate together in how we perceive that. The second point I wanted to make, and I'll close there, is I know the next panel is looking at crisis and fragility. And I know there's a debate about can we do global gateway in these settings? And I just wanted to provide a few reflections there. One, 37 countries. If we look at, I mean, the UN wouldn't qualify a country as fragile. We have fragile contexts, but not fragile countries. But if we look at OECD, there's a classification of fragility. 37 countries that the Global Gateway is active in are on that fragile country list. So in essence, the Global Gateway is active in these countries. We also see this as very valuable because we need to bring in mechanisms to de-risk investments in these highly fragile contexts. So we welcome the fact that it's that you are active in these areas. There might be different investments, maybe big infrastructures are building bridges and those kind of things, or the energy plan that you mentioned, it may not be the most appropriate, but there is investments you're doing in health and education at community level that actually make a lot of sense and help communities survive these very difficult periods. And that requires boots on the ground. That'll be my second example of the work we do, again, not necessarily qualified as fragile, but definitely a conflict situation, an ongoing war in Ukraine, where we're working with the Commission, with EIB, and we have a roving team working with local authorities to implement EIB loans. And these loans are for community infrastructure, schools, clinics, emergency centers, hospitals, all of that kind of work. And what is required is somebody to literally sit with these local authorities that can be sometimes as small as 10 to 15,000 inhabitants. You can imagine a local authority there that needs to manage that in an active war situation, and then trying to tell them, well, but you need to involve civil society, and you need to think about gender, and you need to think about, so there's all these requirements that come with an EIB loan that are valuable, and I think we all stand behind, but are difficult to implement if you're a local authority. So we, in effect, sitting there together with them to try to work them through what does it mean to implement an EIB loan according to these conditions so that this thing is moving. And so with a relatively small investment, and we now see a lot of, I mean, we have 104 social infrastructures that have been built, as I mentioned, schools, hospital, public buildings, benefiting close to 4 million Ukrainians. So it can be done even in an active war situation if we put our hands together. And so really for us, this is where I would want to leave, both the fact that, as I said, that we need to be more deliberate, partnerships come in there, and I think we can find ways to bring the global gateway even in those very fragile settings, as long as we keep the SDGs and leaving no one behind at the center of the efforts as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That was great, actually. There are already emerging themes between our task force. Christian's suggestions, such as deciding together with the partners and breaking the silos, and they were exemplified by INPA's case studies. And then we had the UNDP perspective, again, speaking into the same idea of having a comprehensive approach. So, well, building on this perfect synergy within the panel, I'm going to now open the floor to questions and comments. And, using this opportunity from being from the house, I'm going to give first the word to Scott. And maybe you can take my microphone. There's one extra one there.
Good. Got it. Thank you, Jeren. So, yes, I had the great honor of being a participant in the task force. I'm a CEPS senior fellow, also professor at EUI, and my specialty is digital services. Now, what Christian already talked to you about is really where I'd like to focus today, that really the kind of initiatives that we have the potential to do, on the one hand, include build out of infrastructure, but in fact, an awful lot of what I heard was the potential role for Europe as a role model, as an example of best practice in public policy, in regulation, and more. And in fact, a lot of my own personal background has been with regulatory capacity building and with assistance in regulation in multiple countries around the world, Southern Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. So a particular set of points I'd like to make is that the environment in many of these countries is not what we're used to, not actually what provided the basis for the sort of rules that we have in Europe. A lot of my work, again, has been involved with build-out of telecommunications infrastructure, and our rules were designed primarily for Western European countries that already had a complete build-out of the fixed communications network. In much of the world, the real network is the mobile network. Getting connectivity to cities along the coast with submarine cables is relatively easy. Getting it inland is much harder. Getting it to landlocked countries can be particularly challenging. And so it implies a different approach to regulation. My perception has been, in the countries that I work with, they enormously value examples of best practice. They value advice. They also value respect for local specificities, because it's not the same as what we work with every day, and we need to recognize that when we give them that kind of advice. A few flanking points I'd like to make. We heard a bit about the relative role of sustainability versus economic development. They're not in conflict to the degree that they may have once been. The economics of sustainable development are getting progressively better. Sustainable solutions can often be more cost-effective than less sustainable ones today. I guess one other point I'd make before I close is this is no longer just about the pipes. Infrastructure is important, but the use of all these digital technologies is probably more important. So there are many different kinds of initiatives that could bring substantial value to partner countries. And so we need a flexible approach. I'd like to once again commend these really excellent results from our keynote speaker and from our panelists. I think this is a really useful exercise. And with that, back to you, Jared.
Thanks a lot. Perfect to-the-point example, Scott. Now, the floor is open to questions and comments. We have about 45 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Anna Pentrat, and I work for a peace-building organization called Nonviolent Peace Force. I have a comment and two questions. Maybe the first comment is on the paradigm shift from more classic development cooperation to mutually beneficial partnership. I wonder if the panelists could reflect a bit on this shift. Has it really been a shift? I mean, there was already a search for the EU to look at its own interest in previous development cooperation. So is the shift more that it's more visible or more unapologetic? I wonder what really is the shift in there. The two questions. So one question is for Mr. Bagur, sorry, about the point about the 42% of your expenditure last year that were actually on human development and above the limit that had been, the minimum that had been set by the European Parliament. I would like to hear from you if it was challenged, like what have been your thoughts on this type of minimum set by the European Parliament? Was it challenging to reach those targets? Was it useful? It would be interesting because this type of minimum is probably something that is going to be discussed for the next MFF. And MEP Hannah Neumann mentioned the need to have flexibility and accountability. We see a lot of challenges with increased agree on the need for more flexibility, but what type of flexibility is the question? Because flexibility can be used as well to move money, as we've seen with some cushions and rapid response envelopes, to move things toward new political priorities. And the safeguardings that will be discussed for the next MFF are very important. So maybe the European Parliament setting minimums on funding for certain issues, be it peace building, be it human development, could be one of the risk mitigation. So any comments on this would be very useful. And the second question, and I'll stop there, is on a reflection on more flexibility as well, to have a proper use of increased flexibility means having more EU resources to deal with the changing contexts. Yet we see less and less resources for EU staff dealing with contracts and programming. How do we manage this? How do we make sure that we have the right EU expertise to deal with conflict-affected places, to the changes that were mentioned in context, the Lebanon example? How would we make sure that we have EU officials who have the resources to deal with the changes in the situation, have the conflict sensitivity expertise to make sure that the changes don't worsen conflict dynamics? Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Questions to develop, to give a chance to the panel to develop more on the points that they have already made. So, would you like to start with the question directed at you? And
yes, of course I can start. So I will start maybe by the question of the target. So yes, we have targets in our regulation. A lot of targets, too much targets. Climate change 30%, and we had a target by von der Leyen, 3% more. Migration 10%, likability 93%, and a new target by Urpilainen, bring education from 7 to 13%, etc., etc. Then this goes against flexibility, of course, because it's very, very difficult to manage. Reaching the level of inhuman development was not an issue. We were investing already a lot in human development. And health, education are priorities under Global Gateway. And when we built our projects under Global Gateway with an investment component at the core, as we said, we look at a soft component around. It could be vocational training, it could be investing in the right of the labor forces, it could be looking at human rights, good governance, etc. So we tackle different issues around the hard infrastructure. So I think that it will not be an issue in the future to reach a certain level of investment in human development. However, I would personally, I cannot speak on behalf of the Commission for the moment because we are not preparing the MFF yet, but I would prefer not having too much target. But as it has been said, flexibility has to come with accountability. So we have to focus, I think, the discussion on the governance, how we can involve more the European Parliament, how we can involve more the member states in a discussion about the projects we want to implement. And it's not only about the project we implement at EU level, but it's about the projects implemented by all the actors in Europe. We have to increase the coherence between, it's a shared policy, development cooperation, so we have to live with that. But the Commission from the Maastricht Treaty has the right or the obligation to coordinate the policies. And so maybe we could be more active in aligning the different activities in member states and at EU level with the objectives. So the importance of Team Europe approach. On the expertise or the how we accommodate the changes. So we have a change management plan. We look at the organization, not only in headquarters, but in delegation as well, to adapt. We use the natural, let's say, movement in the organization, people that retire, people that leave the organization to replace with the right expertise. and we do a lot of effort in training. The I'm not sure, to be frank, that we cannot accommodate a reduction in administrative budget if it is a reasonable one. Okay, if any organization can improve its efficiency over time, so reducing the cost is a reasonable objective, if it's not harsh cut, of course. So I think that we can accommodate some efficiency within the organization. On the shift, I think that what we want to highlight is that we don't want to be in a donor-recipient relation. We think that the partner country can bring a lot on the table, and that we want to be as well clear about our own interests. So it's a question of transparency as well. So we have interest, our partner countries have interest, so we can do partnership where both parties find benefits in the relations. So that there is no hidden agenda in a way. Okay? So at the same time, so we, as I said in my introductory remarks, the starting point is always the needs of the partner country. So there is, in a way, two approaches: a bottom-up approach. It starts from the request for sustainable development by the partner countries, and then we look at the same time through a top-down approach at the interest of the European Union, and we see how both can match. So I think that the situation now, as far as not only in a way when we plan Global Gateway, but when we implement all the different programs and projects we have, I think that we are more mature in the relation we have with our partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me maybe come in on that last point, on the shift. Because I think on the one hand, we appreciate if you introduce something new, you'd like to distinguish from what was there. But at the same time, it comes at a risk, because it's almost seen, I mean, the term traditional could be seen as antiquated or something that we want to move away from. And it brings me back to my earlier point. We need to be deliberate, right? If we have global gateway investments and we have traditional ODA, that should become, there needs to be a deliberate usage of those tools together. So not one is traditional, we keep on doing it because it's charity, and right? But finding a way that all of our investments line up. And so what I think what we're doing on the other side, on the non-global gateway side, for example, is also very non-traditional, and we need to move to that. Right? Let me give you two examples. When I was in Zimbabwe, this is already 3 years ago, but we had a large program with EU, UK, Sweden, where we said we want to move away from every single year having 1 million people needing food assistance in the lean months. Right? So let's deliberately invest in doing something different. The non-traditional way of looking at it was that we agreed on the target. We want to get 1 million people out of the humanitarian assistance. How? To be looked at locally, what the context in those particular communities. Even our contracts with the partners we're working with, a lot of the CSOs we're working with, were flexible, which was difficult for the EU to accept, difficult for the UN to accept, difficult for everybody except the CSOs to accept. But we were able to actually say, if something wasn't working, stop and do something else, because we've got evidence from another region, right, that it works. So that flexibility in the traditional development needs to be there. Another example, we're now negotiating in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we're looking at energy efficiency. And we're asked to achieve, I think it's 0.4 kilowatt hours per euro of savings. So it's 1 million kilowatt hours per year of savings. How you do it is for you to discuss with government, and this could be municipal buildings that you refurbish, this could be street lighting that you look at from a solar perspective, this could be water treatment that you look at differently. But what I want my traditional ODA dollar to go to, or euro to go to, is that energy saving. And I think that more flexible model of looking at things for me, it's completely non-traditional. That didn't happen 20 years ago, but it's something that we need to bring into this perspective as well. So for me, it's that let's not distinguish between these pockets. Let's be deliberate in how we use them, and in each of these, let's live with the times and look at different ways of doing things.
Okay, it works. Yeah, I just want to quickly add to that regarding the shift and paradigm. I also would agree that, of course, European interests also played a role in previous cooperations. I think in the discussions we had, we see that this partnership approach can now be perceived as more as an equal approach to cooperation, as a more transparent way of also articulating European interests. In that, however, of course, it has to be made sure that there is now there's a balance between those interests, between the EU and its partner countries. And last point regarding the resources, I think, yeah, on the one hand, of course, it's about how can efficiency be improved to still deliver with constrained budgets. The other point I would like to make is that the question is also focus. I think we heard in the beginning, in the keynote, that we have over 220. I have 225 flagship projects in my head, but I will. So if it's 250, it's still a lot of flagship projects. So maybe one approach could also be, yeah, to focus more on selected flagship projects which have a more regional impact, yeah, to be as effective as possible with the investment. But thank you.
On the number of flagship, I can reconcile both, because we have 225 now, but we will have 250 with the Hungarian presidency. So a few flagship projects should be adopted by the COREPER normally this week, but yeah, so that's okay. We are all aligned, in fact.
Thanks for the clarification about the numbers. And it seems like the panel is kind of in an agreement that it's a transitionary period, a lot of trial and error, shifting the paradigm from the traditional ODA to flexible yet accountable approach. So are there any other, please?
I have one question. It somehow links also to the keynote I made. So you all spoke that we need to reconcile the needs of the partner countries and the EU. When I hear the word partner countries and I think of Egypt, do we talk about Sisi, or do we talk about civil society organizations that try to somehow resist his autocratic rule? When we talk about partner country and I say Mali, do we talk about the military junta? Or do we talk about local communities that are just suffering from this conflict? And this is a question when we go into infrastructure, especially we need to answer, because maybe Sisi is just happy letting us build 10 bridges, and then he will like the Chinese more again.
No, but you know, I think that first point, we have to continue to engage with the government of the partner country. This is important. There are very, very few situations where we cannot engage and we cannot support what they are doing. Of course, in the 3 countries of the Sahel, for obvious reason, in Afghanistan, etc. So we have another country where indeed we cannot work with the partner, with the authorities, and we do directly to the civil society organization to support the citizens, as we cannot do projects with the government. In other cases, we have a mixed approach. Of course, we engage with the government, we work with the government to improve the situation in the country, as we need to support the government policies, if we agree with them, of course. But if we want to support, if we want to be present in the education sector, it's better to discuss with the government about the education policy. how they will not discriminate between women, girls and boys rather than to building school, you know. So we need to engage with them, and at the same time we need to support the communities or the human rights defenders. So both approach can be reconciled, and we do that daily, in fact, to engage with the government and at the same time to support civil society, to build civil society platforms so that they are able, building their capacity to engage with the government for participating in decision-making process or to control how the policies are applied across the country. But I know this is a difficult question, and we need sometimes to do trade-off. We need to, and any situation is different, and we need really to make an assessment case by case. But I think that as a principle, keeping the relation is important to make evolved the country. If we cut the relationships, then we will not be present, we will not be able to move things forward.
Yeah, and maybe just borrowing the example of Afghanistan, because the first reaction after the Taliban takeover was, let's stop all development, right? We'll just do humanitarian, we'll stop all development. And I must commend the EU after a few months of heavy discussions of shifting the development paradigm to community level. And so against the odds, and we have a program together where we're supporting 35,000 women-owned SMMEs in Afghanistan, who each in turn employ women, and who are active in the economy and are allowed to be active. It doesn't necessarily immediately change the situation, which is horrible for women in that country. But it provides, in my view, a more sustainable lifeline, a more dignified lifeline for those women and the families they support, than to be forced into a food lineup, right? And we also realize it can't be done with everybody, with all vulnerable levels of population, because I mean, there's segments of the population, sorry, that need humanitarian support. But the fact that there was a deliberate decision to invest in development, not at the national level, not with the de facto authorities, but with communities and with individuals, I think is a very important step. And as you said, it's not, you need to look at each country specifically. Can you engage with the national authorities? Could you engage at a sector maybe specifically? Or do you shift into national level or to community level even? But there is obviously that inherent risk that I would say, if we look at fragility or crisis in the world, there's countries we thought stable and we all invested in, and it flips. So I think that's an inherent risk, I think, that we need to be able to deal with. But the fact that the mechanisms are flexible to shift from national level investment to local and community level, I think is a very, very vital part of EU support. So, thank you.
Yeah, can I commenting on this? EU does have formal mechanisms for civil society organizations and local authorities, like the advisory platform. Unlike its competitors, if I may, like the BRI of China, for example, who, as far as I know, directly and only talks with the government. So I was wondering if you have, maybe UNDP has any experience comparing, like in Afghanistan, for example, China's approach versus the EU's approach. Is there any room for collaboration across like these global connectivity initiatives like Global Gateway, BRI, and others in bringing in the non-governments, non-state actors in the partner countries, I wonder?
Very easy question. In all honesty, I mean, and I can't speak for the entire UN system, of course, but in the countries I served, and this is my earlier point also vis-a-vis the EU Global Gateway, we're not often intensely involved in the designing of these big investments as a UN system, which I think is something we'd like to be more involved in, as I mentioned, because we do feel there's a role that we can play if we're better involved. what I do see at the national level, I think what we need to guard for is that we're forcing governments to choose between competing models. We're saying there's a China model, there's a US model, there's a European model, there's a UK model. I don't know if there's one, but right, and that we force governments to choose what. Okay, I'll choose this one, and I don't have to work with civil society, or I choose that one where I do, because that, I think, is A, it's a false choice, and B, it's a waste of the few development resources that are there to help achieve the SDGs. So I'm not naive. I know that there's a lot of politics involved, but the more we can do to work with partners, with our governments, to influence how they need to see the value of civil society in this, and the value of sort of hearing from their populations, but doing so not in another way of sort of fixing the different competitive models or putting the different competitive models next to each other and say you'll have to choose, but finding a way that we create a platform where it is possible for everybody to engage. And of course, Global Gateway has that in its principles, and I think the EU's engagement in general has that in its principles. And we need to find a way, as the UN, we're built up on a shared set of values. We find a way that becomes the norm in how we do these bigger investments as well. Knowing the politics are there, but being more involved, as I said, and being more deliberate about how we invest.
Can I ask the same question I see that you are ready to respond on that, because especially after Trump's second presidency, I see China is making overtures to the EU to work together in the partner countries. Do you see the same approach?
Okay. No, first, Global Gateway is a values-based offer. And so we have key principles such as democracy, high standards, good governance, transparency, equal partnership, etc. So, civil society organizations are crucial in any democratic system, and they are an asset in themselves. So, we encourage the delegation. It's more than encourage. There is an instruction to the delegation to set up a roadmap for engagement with civil society and to build platform locally, to discuss our policies, to discuss our programming documents, and to discuss our programs and projects. And at the central level, of course, we have this dialogue with Concord, but we have as well the Policy Forum for Development, and within the Policy Forum for Development, we have put in place a Global Gateway Civil Society and local authorities advisory platform. And we have to use maybe more this platform in the future that we have do so far, but this is a signal that we want to engage with the civil society. Partner, we have values. Our offer is based on values. We are happy to partner with any government that respects those values, that respects human rights and democracy.
Please, and then I saw.
Thank you. Isabel from the UK mission here. It seems like the natural point to come in with a question about partnership with third countries, since we've talked about partnership countries and civil society, and building on some points that George has already made. So yes, I'd like to ask specifically about the role of coordination and cooperation with like-minded third countries under the next phase of Global Gateway. Of course, there's several positive examples under the current iteration of Global Gateway. We have successful partnerships under the Just Energy Transition Partnership, particularly in Vietnam, information sharing with the US on Lobito Corridor, and so on. So of course there's cooperation happening, but particularly considering the challenges that we collectively face in the context of, as Global Gateway phrases it, the 360 approach, regarding working in fragile contexts, bringing in equality dimensions, and so on. I'd be just curious as to where partnership and information sharing with third countries comes into the vision for the next phase. Thank you.
I have to respond, I suppose. Or no, okay. So no, the global gateway is implemented through what our favorite approach is the Team Europe approach. So it's a collaborative method of delivery, external action, bringing together EU institutions and all the organizations within the member states. So we are talking about their diplomacy network, their development bank, their IFIs, even their trade promotion organization, export credit agencies, etc. So, we support the development of Team Europe initiative. But from the start, we have said that Team Europe is a club, but not a closed club. So we are very happy to partner with the UN, World Bank, etc. upfront in the design of the Team Europe initiative, so they can bring their expertise and then participate in the implementation at a certain point if we consider they could have an added value in the implementation of the project. Same thing for the like-minded. Okay? So we welcome the involvement of Norway, UK, Switzerland, Canada, USA. First, in the G7, we have the GPII. The G7 is committed to invest 600 billion in investment, and Global Gateway, in fact, is the contribution of Europe to the GPII. And so we work closely in the G7, of course, with UK, USA, and Canada outside the EU. So we know that we have a difficult relationship so far with UK because we have to overcome a number of political issues, but once the political issues have been overcome, there is no reason that we can deepen our collaboration and cooperation because we have so much in common, and I think that our partnership will bring a lot to the partner country.
Then, yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm Inge Brees from Search for Common Ground, a peace-building NGO. And I had a question around, well, infrastructure isn't neutral, right? So you only have to look here in Belgium at Oosterweel or windmills or goodness, what a can of worms. And that's not different in third countries. And one of the things that we're doing as an organization is giving conflict sensitivity training, and it starts with an example of a school being built in DRC, and 1 week later it's burned down, and think why. So even a school is not neutral infrastructure. It can change power dynamics, and even more so if you're working in a conflict context. So my question is around conflict assessments for global gateway projects, and who's responsible to do them? And if risks are identified, is there any way still to pull the plug if needed? And then who decides that? Because at a certain point you have so much vested interests from the country itself, from European companies, from some big member states. I can't see a person in the EU delegation doing this risk assessment to be the decision maker on this. So who is the final decision maker if it needs to be stopped because the risks are too high to cause conflict?
Okay, so I think this question is for the second panel, maybe, because you will have more information, more discussion on this. What I can say about Global Gateway, and that Global Gateway is totally embedded in our procedures. I mean, it's not a fund. It's not a fund. It's not a tool. It's a concept. It's a strategy. And for implementing Global Gateway, we use our toolbox, what exists, rounds, loans, and all our process and procedures. So this means that what applies to the, let's say, normal projects, or projects that are not Global Gateway, apply to Global Gateway, including all the due diligence. So when we look at a Global Gateway project, we do feasibility study. For instance, under the Lobito corridor, we do not have a committed funds for the moment, simply because we are waiting for feasibility study, and feasibility study take time, because we have to see the impact on environment, the impact on local communities, the impact on growth, the impact on employment, etc., etc. And of course, the conflict dimension has to be to take into account as the other one. So when we talk about global gateway projects, we do not talk about projects that should be designed, decided following specific rules. No, we use the normal rules. And when we talk about accountability, for instance, our project, Global Gateway project, go to comitology, like the other ones. So the member states are there to give their advice and approval on the project. So, but I think you will have more response in the next panel about the specific case of a conflict assessment.
Any more questions? Carol? Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I had to step out for a few minutes, and when I came back, you were talking about GPII, which was exactly what I wanted to ask, because it was a little bit the GPII seems to be an excellent idea, but I honestly haven't heard a lot of follow-up since the initiation of it. So it seems to be a little bit of, again, a case of political intuition. Yes, there is merit in coordinating with G7 partners, and I would dare say, as we have discussed before, beyond as well. So again, this is an interesting methodology on learning how to cooperate with partners to go then beyond the G7. That is how I would stretch it. But yeah, how is it leveraging because yes, Global Gateway is part of GPII, but how is it leveraging it in order to scale up? Because to scale up, we need partners, we need friends, and G7 is kind of like there already, so it should be very low-hanging fruit. And then again, using this as a methodology to go beyond the G7, because we have, well, today we have the UN, we have the World Bank, we have, the list is very long, and BRI also is another one to see what is the complementarity with. Do we need to necessarily enter in competition with BRI? Maybe somewhere yes, but maybe not in full. Maybe there is the room for complementarity, and I dare say also cooperation in some areas, because at the end of the world we all live in the same world, and climate change is affecting all of us. So competition there is not necessarily for the benefit of humans.
I have to respond again to this question, I think. But no, I think that increasing cooperation, coordination, and coherence, even within the G7, is not a low-hanging fruit. Really. I've been negotiating, for instance, the communiqué for the development ministerial, and it is always really difficult to align, even if we are like-minded. But I think that what is important with GPII is that GPII has put investment at the core of our partnership, and it became, in fact, the main feature of a lot of cooperation across the world. So we have the UK Facility for Investment, I think. We have the Piano Mattei. We have the GPI in USA. So we see that the fact that we have put the ambition first, so that we want to mobilize 600 billion euro of investment in the coming years, has in a way set the tone. Okay, so this was important to have this ambition at the G7. Second, in a way, this increased the cooperation. As we discuss GPII, we have a specific working group under the G7 that follow GPII. And now we have a secretariat for GPII. So it's a virtual secretariat with not permanent staff, but staff that is put there by the G7 members. But it's important to see that we try to structure and to formalize the work. But the fact that we have this GPI, this increased the cooperation, and I think that Italy joining Lobito Corridor, committing 250 million, I think, is because is thanks to GPII. Okay, so this without GPII, I'm not sure that Italy will be ready to invest in the Lobito corridor. So this increase the level of cooperation. But again, so this is an objective, and to implement the GPII, we need first that each and every donor put in order his own cooperation in a way. So that's why we have Global Gateway, we have the Piano Mattei, the GPI, etc. And we need to cooperate with others beyond the G7. So that's why I was saying that Team Europe initiative is not a closed club. We try to scale up by attracting other funding as much as possible. So Regional Development Bank, we partner with the American Development Bank, with Asian Development Bank, we partner with the World Bank, with the UN, etc., etc. Yes. Anything more about G7?
One more question, I think. Let's just.
Thanks. Sorry, one follow-up question again from me, Anna Penfrat from Nonviolent Peace Force. It was great to hear the example from Afghanistan with the shift to more community-level development, and to hear you, sir, about the work with the civil society roadmaps, the Policy Forum for Development, etc. We know all of this exists, but with the massive increased attention at the moment on the Global Gateway and those big amounts, there is also this tension of balance with also looking at how we can improve the funding that goes to civil society that are doing amazing work in fragile contexts and less fragile contexts. And this is a massive part of what can contribute to the SDGs. How do you think we can reconcile that? And I'm thinking even at the level of the parliament or the member states, I mean, I don't think there is any CODEV discussions on how can we make EU funding and other actors funding more flexible so that it actually can support incredible efforts from local civil society actors in those contexts for the SDGs. All of the attention is going to the Global Gateway. How can, like, just zoom in, it seems, at least from the outside. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, and how can we also balance this out? I mean, there are lots of discussions at OECD level on how to better support enabling environments for civil society that don't fit in those discussions on the Global Gateway. How can we bring this in? Or maybe it's already happening and I don't know.
No, I think that civil society fits within Global Gateway. You know, first I look at the funding. Okay, do we have a reduction in funding for civil society? No. Over the last period, it was more or less 1.2 billion per year for civil society organization. Last year, it was 1.3. Okay, we have the inflation, maybe, but there is no really a reduction in funding to civil society organizations. And the modalities, when we implement Global Gateway, we talk about the 360 approach. So this means that around a big infrastructure that is financed, by the way, by the private sector, maybe, so this will be the ideal project, that we don't put public money, that first of all we have private money, or financed through loans by a bank. We come with our own ODA to support soft measures around the investment. So we build enabling environment. And there, the civil society can have a role. So if we talk, for instance, about improving the right of the labor force, we can use civil society for that. So there is no by principle, I think, less room for civil society under Global Gateway. Okay? What we are doing is building package and introducing coherence in what we are doing. So maybe some civil society organization will lose, others will benefit from Global Gateway. Okay? But at the end, I think that there is room for partner with civil society, not only in looking at what we do in country and coming back to us with feedback, because we need this feedback, and that's why we have this platform, local platform, and the platform at central level, because it's important to know. They know things that the delegation don't know, so we need them. But beyond that, they have a role to implement some components of the Global Gateway projects.
Thank you. These questions and answers actually help us to understand the exact mechanisms and think collectively on them. On that positive note, hopefully, we are coming to the end of our panel and we are right in time for the coffee break. We don't have to cut into the coffee break, so please enjoy a little break downstairs from here. And we'll be back here at 11:50. Thank you. Thanks a lot to my fellow panelists.
Good or bad, or sometimes very critical when we see, and there are a lot of reports about Global Gateway. So this is very interesting. But, okay. We received this morning a report from a network of 9 NGOs, but I don't remember the names. About very good report, by the way. So, yeah, but we see a lot. We are reports in member states, foundations that work on Global Gateway in member states. But it could be the case for some head of delegation as well, I'm sure you, that they are, sometimes we are very surprised by the level of knowledge of what they have in their daily life. This is almost inexistent. But BRI has 10 years old. Last year, it was the 10 years old anniversary. 10 years anniversary of the initiative. So. was the best month. The communication was December 21. 22 was the best month, really. The scope, what we do, the governance, etc. And we have started rolling out Global Gateway 1 year now. So it's not so long, I think. Yeah, you are welcome, and thank you for the invitation. No, unfortunately, no. No, don't say for the night. No, because I was informed too late. Even if it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, for me it's too late to accommodate. So I was not coming back. So thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone. If you could please take a seat, and I already invite the panelists to come in and sit on stage in no particular order. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Lucia. All right, welcome back to the second part of this event on the future directions of the EU's economic foreign policy. My name is Fanny Sauvignon. I'm a researcher here at CEPS, and I will be your moderator in which we, for this panel, in which we will discuss global gateways' intersection with peace and security, especially in fragile and conflict-affected situations, and how the conflict gap may be closed. So this systematically came up during our task force, but also already today during the first panel, and it is also something we have started looking at CEPS, especially in the context of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor and its Eastern Mediterranean segment. So without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker, Melis Al-Gadguadis, who is a policy officer at the European External Action Services, Peace, Partnerships and Crisis Management Directorate. Melis, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Fanny. And also thanks for organizing this event. I think it's very timely, and everyone has actually really referred to the incoming commission. But also perhaps to underline that it's coming at a time where next Monday we're going to have the adoption of the MTR, so the midterm review conclusions. So in that respect, I very much appreciate also with GPPI this, let's say, spotlight on, well, it's called the conflict gap, but I would rather perhaps say the financing gap for the conflict-affected countries. And of course, where I'm sitting in the peace partnership and crisis management, this is obviously what we are also closely following. Also from the perspective, and this morning we heard from Hannah Newman, the emphasis on the integrated approach. And I'm actually part of the team, a small team, but there is still a team within the EAS that is responsible for the implementation of the integrated approach. So with that, I'd like to perhaps give a few ideas, but I understand that this will be an interactive session, so hopefully we'll get to answer some of the questions, including some of the questions that were raised perhaps during the first panel, but that also relates very closely to our discussions now in the second panel. So let's start with the let's say, news that is not news, because those of you that is around this room know about it. And we've heard about it also in the opening, that post-midterm review, we are navigating a reality of fewer resources. So that is a reality that we have to take into account, including reduced financing specifically earmarked for peace. So at the same time, we have this, but at the same time, the world faces an alarming rise in the violent conflicts and crises around the world, with more people than ever affected by instability. And this juxtaposition, unfortunately, underscores the critical challenge before us. How do we maximize the impact of peace funding? George, you also referred to intentionality before, while fostering greater synergies across all our instruments at the EU level to meet these growing needs. Over the last decade, the EU policy framework gradually evolved from a loose coordination to a full-fledged and ambitious integrated approach in 2018. And actually, I remember 2 weeks into when I joined the ES 6 years ago, I was invited to CEPS because there was actually this study on the integrated approach. And at the time, we were more at the, let's say, conceptual phase still. And since then, a lot of things have happened. A lot of things have happened also on the financing side when it comes to the integrated approach, and NDC Global Europe has been part of this integration agenda. Peace, stability, and conflict prevention is not only a priority that cuts across basically all the pillars of NDC Global Europe, but, and I think that's probably a key point to underline in this session, conducting a conflict analysis has also become mandatory for all fragile and in-conflict countries to ensure conflict sensitivity of our development assistance. And that is thanks to the regulation and thanks to the role in the negotiation of the regulation of the European Parliament, actually. So, is everything perfect? No. So we have a good policy framework, and there's been some positive developments, including the conflict analysis requirement that I mentioned. But of course, much more can be done and should be done to bridge what was called in this session the conflict gap in practice. One of the key challenges that we're facing today are overall global conflict and funding trends. So currently there are 56 active conflicts. And I think Hannah was mentioning this morning that indeed the attention usually maximum goes to 2 in terms of the highest level political attention. That leaves 54. And this has been actually the most since the end of the Second World War. So we see really a trend that is actually quite worrying. And even more worrying so is that few conflicts are being resolved either militarily or through peace agreements. So it's not that, you know, therefore we'll see any reduction soon to come. On the other hand, there's empirical research, and I think the CPRI findings are very clear that conflicts or countries that avoid conflict relapse are those that receive a significantly higher share of peace ODA. And not ODA, peace ODA specifically. Yet according to the 2021 OECD DAC report, we've actually seen the trend that peace ODA for OECD DAC countries, so I'm not referring to the EU, but in general for OECD DAC countries, has actually been falling to 10.8% of the total ODA share. By contrast, however, the DAC members' humanitarian spending has actually increased to 28% of their ODA share, and that has been a record high. So we see the humanitarian funding because the needs are rising, and yet the peace intentional ODA shrinking. And we know that without peace, humanitarian needs will not decrease, nor will development objectives, and we mentioned SDGs, will be reached. So what do we do with that? Designing and implementing the integrated approach to crisis is crucial for tackling these complex multi-causal and constantly changing drivers of violence and fragility. And also to address solutions and prevent forced displacement. And I think this morning there was a reference saying the integrated approach relates to defense, and I wanted to come back to that because that's actually a misperception. The integrated approach actually refers what I would call the HDP nexus plus, because it's HDP nexus plus it brings together the security elements as well. But it's actually broad and much broader than the defense, and that's the whole spirit of the integrated approach. And especially with the limited resources that we have that are dedicated specifically for peace, I think the thematic program that actually we're managing together with FBI colleagues, and I'm very glad to have therefore Eva today here, is actually accounting to 1.1% of global Europe basically financing. So that's also the reason why we need to look at it holistically to all the resources that we have under Global Europe. And of course, I'm sure Eva will back me in saying that the crisis response also funding, so the flexible funding that we have with this rising trend of conflicts has been also very much overstretched over the last years. So we need to ensure that geographic programs are not only conflict sensitive, but they are also used more purposefully. So your reference to the intentionality to support peace investments at local level over the long run. After all, peace building is a complex social and political process that take a decade or more, and therefore we cannot afford just having a short fix to these problems. And as peace is a collective endeavor with several EU services contributing, I'm also very pleased that we have John with us because he is actually in INPA, and of course INPA plays also a key role in the geographic programming, and particularly for the African continent, which is also the region which is probably affected the most by the number, at least the number of countries that are affected most by violent conflicts. So with that, I'll perhaps pass over the...
Thank you, and I look forward to coming back to you with questions. I would now like to, I think it's only you and Abby who have to share microphones, I'm sorry. I would now like to give the floor to Hilde Demen, who is the Executive Director at Search for Common Ground's Europe office. Please.
Thank you. And thanks, Melis, for really setting the stage. And I think you're a big ally to many of us within the peace building sector. So I think you've actually covered some of my speaking points, which is great. And I wanted to maybe speak more from the practitioner point of view in terms of us as peace building organizations doing this work on the ground, what this all means, right? What does it mean to have overall reduction of ODA going to peace? What does it mean to have to struggle with short-term crisis response interventions and not have the long-term type of funding? It has very real implications for the work that we do and for the results that we're able or not able to achieve. I think many in the room would recognize that. And just to give a very concrete example of what you're saying, the work we do is very complex and it requires time. As you were saying, Melis, we had a gathering just a few years ago with the 35 country directors of Search. We work in 35 countries. If I ask my colleagues, how long does it take for you to have sustainable impact? It takes 8 to 10 years. This is how long it takes to work in societies that are impacted by conflict, where there's deep distrust between communities or deep distrust between communities and their governments. This is not something that can be fixed in 18 or 30 months, right? So there's a real gap. There's a problem with the amount of money, and there's a problem with the longevity of the funding, and there's a problem with the quality of the funding. That's where I see some of the big conflict gaps. And what we see in reality then, what that leads to is that we have a problem increasingly. There are more and more violent conflicts in the world, and because we're not able to significantly address and solve some of these conflicts, when there's a big international conflict that breaks out like Ukraine or Palestine, it has impact in these countries where we have unresolved conflicts, right? The fact that the Sahel has become so immersed in such a complex puzzle with external actors, it is because those conflicts have never been solved. And so the question is the problem in Central African Republic, is the problem Russia, or is the problem that we've never been able to deal with the instability and the fragility in a sustainable way? And so that's really something that we need to get better at as a collective international community, to drain the bathtub of ongoing conflicts and not have this situation of increasing conflicts everywhere. The other point I wanted to make, looking at the conflict gap in Global Gateway as a concept, as a paradigm, whatever we want to call it, for us, there's clearly a need within these type of interventions abroad to continue specific funding for peace building and social cohesion within countries that benefit from Global Gateway interventions. And the reason why I say that is there's many reasons for that. First of all, because the countries that we would consider investable in many places still have pockets of instability, or they could have neighboring countries that are still undergoing a lot of conflict. And so there's often effects that flow over into places like Nigeria or Kenya or Sri Lanka, which are countries that are ready for more foreign investment, but that really have pockets of instability. And for example, to just cite a case of Kenya or Sri Lanka, when you have countries like that where there's a history of conflict, where there's a history of unresolved grievances, whenever there's a big moment like a big political reform or elections, there's really a risk of falling back into open violence. And if you have not at that moment invested in peace building infrastructure and capabilities, it can go quickly very wrong. And then lastly, and that was said also this morning in the first panel, any external intervention through the Global Gateway or others can be conflict triggers, right? Everybody who works within the peace building sector, we know that any resources you bring into a context, if you do not think carefully about the partners you work with, about your procurement, about your service, there's so many ways that you impact on dynamics that exist that we really need to just keep that into account and make it work better. So what do we do about it? From our perspective, we recommend to any donor that we work with, the EU is one of our main partners, but we have many donors, and we advise our partners to look at their funding instruments at 3 levels. Of course, we need what we get through the fantastic partnership with FPI, the type of crisis response, where we're able to very quickly say we see a situation deteriorate here, this is what we want to do, this is what our teams are saying. With 18 or 20 or 24 months, whatever, we can do some quick fixes. So we need that. And we need more of that. We don't need less of that. Secondly, we really, really, really need, and this is where the conflict gap sits, we need long-term funding to address root causes of conflict. And it sounds like a very basic thing to say, I hope in front of this audience, but it's not there today from the EU side. And it's really a big gap. And addressing root causes does not only happen by investing in education and health and social services, right? Social cohesion is a different type of programming, and we need dedicated funding from that. We have, as Search for Common Ground, we often partner with the US government, for example. We have several programs funded by USAID for people-to-people peace interventions. They're 5 years, sometimes longer. These are programs that really allow you to work on the long term. So that's what we need also with the EU. And then lastly is the integration of peace building and conflict sensitivity in everything else, right? And can we get specific conflict outcomes in any big humanitarian or development program? That is something else that we would really like to see. That is, some of it is there, but not everything. And then lastly, what I would say, it is indeed a reality that funding is decreasing. If that is the reality, can we then make sure that the funding that is still there is of better quality? And I would define a few criteria for quality. Quality means predictability, so that we know for how long we can rely on which funds. Predictability is really key. Long term, I think I've made that clear. Flexibility, and by flexibility, we of course mean flexibility not for you to change course when political priorities change. Flexibility means we work in a context where we have long-term intervention, there's a coup that breaks out, or there's a civil war in a neighboring country, and there's a huge influx of IDPs and refugees. How can we shift our programs to better adapt to changing needs on the ground? And then lastly, local. And I know this seems, again, a given, but in fact it's not. And we see many of our donors moving more and more to the bigger programs and the bigger contractors, which makes it very hard to work with local civil society. And all of us as civil society NGOs here, I think we're all very committed to the localization agenda, but for that we need backing of our donors. And the only way to do it is by mitigating risks, but being cognizant that risks do exist, being open to engage with that and allow us trial and error, and allow us that adaptability that in today's financing structures can be complex. So I'll leave it to that and then happy to.
Thank you for laying out your recommendations and criteria so precisely, and for reminding us that anything can be a conflict trigger, even with the best of intentions. Now I turn to Abigail Watson, who is a research fellow at our partner for this event, the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for organising this event, and Stefana and the rest of the CEPS team. I guess I want to drill into one of the questions that's been throughout the discussion today, both earlier this morning, and just now, and is also a pertinent question in the briefing, which you should have close by. The festive period is among us, so consider it as a good stocking filler. And I think one of the questions that has come up a lot is, how is the EU going to address fragility, conflict, and emerging crisis in places like the Sahel, the Middle East, and elsewhere, when its priorities seem to be somewhere else? And the Global Gateway conflict gap is one big part of this, and it's exacerbating the broader problem within the EU funding structure. We've already talked about it today, about how it seems like flexible funding is being cut. The rapid response mechanism and the emerging challenges and priorities cushion are now heavily depleted, which means that, as Melis already said, as crises are going up, the EU's ability to react quickly seems to be going down. And secondly, the funding that was spent has been mostly spent in enlargement and neighbourhood areas. So that's, I think, about 3/4 of the rapid response mechanism, and about half the cushion has been spent in those areas, which of course is important, but it does raise serious questions about what the EU will do in the face of crises like the one in Sudan, which we talked about already today, which new reports say the death toll is higher than previously thought, and that the displacement crisis is seeing millions displaced, often to unstable neighbours, creating more conflict drivers in the future, and the EU doesn't seem able to respond in the face of this crisis. And added to this, the independent review has raised serious concerns about how able longer-term funding pots are to bridge the gap in flexible funding in places like Sudan. In its review, it noted that key staff members often felt that peace and security priorities, even when they were mentioned in the multi-annual indicative programs, were sort of dealt with by the thematic peace and security pillar or by the rapid response mechanism, even though the budgets of those parts of EU funding are so much smaller. And it was felt that the geographic pillar could then deal with other and almost completely other priorities in those countries. And the Global Gateway conflict gap matters here. While there is huge potential of Global Gateway for it to revitalise the EU's offer to its partners, it requires a predictability for investment, and that predictability isn't present in conflict-affected countries. And so a prioritisation which shifts the EU's focus towards investment and infrastructure risks marginalising these countries even further and focusing solely on emerging markets. And in doing so, growing this conflict gap, which is present throughout the EU funding mechanism even more. It's nice to see that the new Commission does seem aware of this problem. And one of the responses that it suggested is this Commission-wide integrated approach to fragility and to least developed countries, fragile and conflict-torn countries, and other complex settings. This provides an opportunity for the EU to reconsider its approach to conflict, which is very welcome, and it's also very welcome that a lot of the new team seem aware that this has to be backed up by resources. I know the Commissioner for International Partnerships said in his evidence to Parliament that there needed to be dedicated resources to engage in fragile and conflict-affected countries. But a clear-eyed approach to the EU and to conflict abroad will not treat every crisis the same and will not try and fix fragility everywhere, a term that can be used so broadly that it just sees the EU pick up more technocratic policy tools, often in places where it's easier to run programming rather than based on a careful assessment of what the conflict needs are and how the EU could best respond to them. To be successful, the new approach to fragility instead must be combined with more nimble EU financial tools to support specific peace efforts, to mitigate particular risks, or help local partners to work together towards a more stable political deal which serves citizens better than war. The momentum around Global Gateway also shows us that if this strategic approach has political backing and clear strategic direction around the EU's priorities, with a clearly articulated need to invest in peace and security, not just in the neighbourhood, but also beyond, that it could be really successful. But if the new approach to fragility simply overpromises on a broad definition of fragility and lacks any specificity around funding or any clear direction about the need to fund conflict drivers beyond the EU's neighbourhood, then it's probably just going to be another piece of paper.
Thank you. This is a great transition to Leonard Fried next to me, who is the Strategic Partnerships Manager and EU representative for Interpeace here in Brussels, a member of our task force, and who was nodding all along the time you were speaking. Please, Leonard.
Thank you so much, Fanny. A pleasure to be here, and also thank you to GPPI and SEPS for the invitation. And yes, I was nodding, and it's also good when you go last, you can just agree with a lot of what has been said. I think first on the general trends in conflict and peace and funding, a lot of it has been mentioned, but I think it's worth just reminding again in which situation we are right now. On the one hand, we have the highest number of conflicts, both interstate and intrastate conflicts in the world since the Second World War. And at the same time, we have historic low numbers of ODA to peace. And nobody ever seems to be making a connection between the two of them. So I really want to thank Meles for highlighting that and for pointing out that the countries that actually receive more funding for peace are the ones that also manage to get out of conflict situations better. And I think this is a collective advocacy point that we need to make as practitioners and as institutions also coming up with the MFF negotiations. So that's one point. Related to that, the focus and the prioritization that Hannah Neumann was mentioning is of course necessary with the resource gap that we have. But it's important that with the understandable focus on the neighborhood, we don't forget the other parts of the world. And there, this is particularly important because the EU has been a long-standing partner to many of those countries and conflict contexts. And we know from peace building that to build trust, it takes a lot of time. To destroy trust, it goes very quickly. And then to rebuild it, it takes a long time again. So we need to find this balance in terms of where the EU is engaged, both politically but also financially in the coming years. So that's just on the general overview. Then on the global gateway, I think many of the risks that we from a peace building perspective see have already been mentioned, and they are relevant to the global gateway. I think it was the colleague from UNDP who mentioned that 37 of the countries where so-called flagship projects take place are considered fragile countries. So it's very important to consider those risks. And those risks, they come with the sectors that the Global Gateway works in: energy, climate, critical raw materials, transport, even health. I don't know if you remember the response to the Ebola crisis, for example, in Eastern DRC. It shows how those interventions are never, as was pointed out, conflict neutral, but they can lead to a lot of resistance from communities. There are always questions about land rights, which are often not clear, governance challenges, and also they engage in areas where there's resource scarcity, and they can increase the competition over those resources. And for all those reasons, it's very important that there are clear and rigorous requirements when it comes to conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity assessments. And those need to happen pre-investment, because oftentimes now it's the case that then, as was also pointed out in the previous session in the Q&A, that the decisions are already so well advanced that even if there are concerns raised from, let's say, local NGOs, communities, they are not really being considered because of all the other factors at play. So they need to happen earlier. Then the last point is on maybe the opportunities that the Global Gateway can also present for peace and for closing the conflict gap, as the panel mentioned. So one of the reasons and one of the challenges that the Global Gateway is facing and will face is actually the same challenge that many development finance initiatives and also climate finance initiatives have been facing in the past, which is that the risks in fragile countries are high and the perceived risks are even higher. Oftentimes the perceived risks are actually higher than the real risks. And this leads to very high borrowing rates, both for private and public investors. And one example of that is if you look at the green climate space, and we have the COP going on in Baku right now. Last year, the two biggest vertical climate funds, so that's the Green Climate Fund and the Green Environment Facility, they had together over 1 billion of committed funds which were not spent. And there are many reasons for that, but many of the reasons have to do with exactly the issues we are discussing. Conflict-affected countries, weak governance structures, and just risk which are real or perceived too high for investors to engage. And those challenges the Global Gateway will face as well, particularly when it comes to the objective of crowding in the private sector. And it was mentioned that to meet the target of 300 billion, you need the private sector. So how can peace help in this regard? Interpeace, we joined the global task force on the Global Gateway because we think that an approach on peace finance can help unlock some of those investments and ensure that they are beneficial not only for investors and partner countries, but also for local populations. And the initiative Finance for Peace that Interpeace incubated was started by Germany at the G7 2022 when they held the presidency. And it aims to create a market for peace finance, similar to the market which exists, for example, in the green space with the green bond market. And we have now, together with more than 50 other organizations, developed a peace finance impact framework with peace finance standards to avoid what has happened a bit in the beginning of the green bond market, that there was greenwashing, to avoid peace washing, that it's really clear what are the criteria that qualify an investment for peace. And the organizations that have developed that together with us include the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, but also NGOs like Search for Common Ground, who have given very valuable feedback in the development of those standards. So how can such a peace finance approach help the Global Gateway and close the conflict gap? I give you one specific example. We did a feasibility study of a solar power plant in Ghana. And this was at the border with Burkina Faso, and it aims to power 20% of the energy needs of Burkina Faso, neighboring Burkina Faso. And we found out, or the study found out, that through building in peace building work from the get-go, such as consulting communities, having listening sessions with communities, and also including inclusive benefit sharing for communities, this was lowering the risk, first of all for the communities, but also for the investors. And concretely what it led to was a decrease of the borrowing rate from 19 to 16%. In this case, this is 6 million euros or dollars. And of those 6 million, 1 million was the cost of the peace building action, which means if you do the math, there's 5 million more for the investor, and there's 1 million more for peace building action, which is needed anyway. So this shows how a peace finance approach can de-risk investments in the Global Gateway, both for communities and for investors. So this is just one example. I can come back later with others, how we think that while peace is not one of the 5 priority sectors of the Global Gateway, it needs to be central, not only to avoid some of those risks, but to really help unlock the potential that the Global Gateway has on development and sustainable peace.
Thank you. I'm always impressed when Interpeace makes the business case for peace, as cynical as it sounds. And I have this opportunity to remind you that in our upcoming task force report, there will be some recommendations on the financial aspects of Global Gateway. And I have more burning questions, but since many people work on Global Gateway in the EU, in Team Europe, but also within the Commission, I would like to turn to the responses from two of our guests, starting with John McCarrick of the Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. I'd like to give you 2-3 minutes to hear from you.
Thank you very much. Works now. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for this really interesting discussion. Gives us a lot of food for thought, given that we're moving into a new political mandate, probably in the next few days. So I am a policy officer working on the Africa-Europe partnership, and Global Gateway is a very big part of that. I wanted to give you maybe a few examples where the European Union has been supporting countries in fragile contexts to maybe understand how Global Gateway can be a driving force for social cohesion and stabilizing economies after a conflict. One that really comes to mind that is a very strong memory for me was when I traveled to Cameroon last year in 2023. And we traveled to the north of Cameroon, to the Cameroon-Chad border, which is faced with a lot of instability with Boko Haram. The Global Gateway strategy has been investing there in a strategic corridor, so a highway that runs between N'Djamena and the capital of Cameroon, Yaoundé. So that runs across the Cameroon and Chad border, which is facing a lot of instability and insurgency from Boko Haram. It crosses a river, and essentially the two communities on that side of those two sides of the borders had never been connected. Boats crossed between the country and the river before that, and the bridge is currently being almost completed. The bridge is going to offer many economic opportunities to the people there, but I wanted to maybe circle back to a point that Leonard mentioned about the Global Gateway in general. When we think of the Global Gateway, we kind of imagine that the European Union comes in and says, we're going to build a highway, we're going to invest in a hospital, we're going to engage in a project, but there isn't really any engagement with the local community. And when I talk about, say, this strategic corridor and specifically the bridge across the border, there was a very strong engagement with the local community and civil society in that region to understand what actually ancillary infrastructure would be helpful for them in terms of progressing social cohesion and giving opportunities to the people in that region to encourage the economy to stabilize. And the feasibility studies realized that they needed a lot of climate mitigation efforts. They obviously needed investment in health and education, but also in youth. So when we think about an investment like that, it isn't just building a highway, it isn't just building a bridge, but the EU's approach when it works in support like that is that it really wants to be a stabilizing force to offer opportunities to a society that has faced instability or fragility like that. I wanted to also give another example of Somalia. And the Global Gateway is investing in the rehabilitation of an important canal system in the country. So it's going to rehabilitate 108 canals, which is going to increase opportunities and livelihoods for probably about 6,000 farmers in the country. So we can imagine the stabilizing effect that's going to have on the economy, allowing, say, the people in that region to have a more food secure environment, but also providing economic opportunities. So I kind of wanted to highlight those ideas for you, that when the Global Gateway is investing, it's also thinking of a more holistic approach in these fragile contexts in general. So thank you very much for the very interesting conversation, and shall I continue?
Thanks, John, for those examples of how Global Gateway can stabilize. And there are many possible steps of conflicts. Our other respondent is Eva Troya Blanco from the Commission Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yes, can you hear me? Perfect. So thank you for the introduction. I am the Deputy Head of Unit dealing with crisis response and peace building and geographically managing crisis response in Africa and the Middle East. So this conversation today is very pertinent for my daily job. Most of the interlocutors today mentioned the fact that, and some of us, some of you also mentioned the fact that we will have a new MFF that is being discussed, although at a very early stage now. Now, let me tell you something. Funds are shrinking, but the one thing we know about the new MFF is that funds will shrink even further. So in this context, the pressure that we are already feeling and that Hilde described really well with funds for the humanitarian aid increasing, but funds for peace actually decreasing, we really feel ourselves being peace building and crisis response, we really feel ourselves cornered because then Global Gateway and investments are taking a lot of space. So we are in situations where, for instance, bilateral assistance to Iraq has been reduced by 75%. And then when someone asks the question, so who is going to do education, who is going to do health, who is going to do long-term development assistance, then eyes look back to ECHO. By the way, we also have colleagues from ECHO here, and to us. And then we are in this absurd, allow me this word, situation that Hilde described where you have to deal with funding for 18 months for needs that are obviously not for 18 months. And we know this, but this is a perversion of how the funds are being used. It's not a perversion of the legal framework, which was actually quite logical. Crisis response is there to act as a first responder together, very often in parallel with humanitarian aid. But it's not there to stay. So that's where the gap, that's where the conflict gap lays. And it's only growing now with further focus on large investments. Although I understand the 360 approach, right? But then that was my first point. My second point would be actually coming back to something that Hannah mentioned this morning, and it's flexibility. Something that is not often mentioned in this shift of paradigm is that we will actually lose flexibility because there will be less money, even less money, for grants. So we will have huge amounts of funding, but we have reduced space to actually respond to local needs specifically. And there was a question before about the enormous work that NGOs are doing locally and with local peace partners. This is where we feel that the gap will grow even bigger. But this actually, there is, I mean, I'm being very negative, but there is light at the end of the tunnel also, we want to think. And this has been recognized in the mission letters that the president has sent to the commissioner designates. And she has actually put it right when she says, we need a specific approach to fragility, which is a sort of recognition that Global Gateway was very much needed, is very much needed as a shift of paradigm, although we discussed this morning whether it's a real shift, but I think we can argue that it is. But there must be bridges to other sorts of cooperation that allow us to respond to the growing needs that we are experiencing right now. And then my third and last point is something that has not been so much mentioned here today, but is another sort of relative perversion of the system as well, and it's the fact that conflicts are increasingly global, while our system, our current NDICI, looks at them mostly, except for crisis response, from a geographical perspective. This is no longer responding to the reality that we're living in. So I was reading statistics, 50% of civil wars have international interference. And more than 90 countries, that's about almost half of the countries around the world, have troops outside of their borders. Now, if you think about this, and we are still trying to allocate our funding from a geographical point of view, then we will never be able to match the gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I can pass the mic directly to Hilde as soon as she stops taking notes from these very interesting points. We were talking earlier about, you were speaking about how can Global Gateway take part in the dealing with fragility sustainably? How do you see this shift? How bad is it?
It's good, and there's always good and bad, right? I think it's important to see nuance, and I think I very much agree with what Leah was saying. There is definitely also opportunity there, right? And I don't think it would be helpful from our end to just have a negative approach only. I think there's also just a reality check. Global Gateway is here, it is here to stay. Let's make it as good as it can be, right? Let's use the potential that there is. But that is only possible if we are seen as a credible interlocutor, and if we have a seat at the table when it comes to conversations around how it's being set up, how it's being designed, and what are the real life implications for the populations. I love the examples that were given by John from INPA, and these seem to be really the type of project we want to move into. I'd love to get a readout for every single one if this is indeed whether there's such clear social cohesion even as an outcome, right? Has this been thought through? And this is where NGOs, but also others, the UN system and others can really come in and be considered as thought partners, even before we get to actual implementation, right? So I think that there is something around conceptualization and thinking through also some of the things I was citing earlier around the quality of the funding. Can we look at some of those criteria, and can we have a seat at the table to discuss that? And then there's the whole element of how do we implement it? How do you measure it in the long term? What are the long-term impacts of some of these investments, right? Those are questions that I'd love to see answered also.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Abby now, also to circle back around this idea of the globalizing conflicts becoming more and more global. You've said that the resources are depleted for rapid response, also that a lot of them have been spent on neighborhood and enlargement countries and regions, and that as a result there's little support left for the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and the Sahel. Do you think, and this is going to be maybe a middle ground question between country focus and global focus, in terms of the EU's neighborhood approach, should, in terms of the EU's external spending, Global Gateway should it integrate wider regions in the neighborhood approach to include maybe the neighbors of the neighbors? We've talked this morning about how this is already the case, that the new commissioner designate for the Mediterranean has really expanded geographical area. Do you think it's just more geographization and will not serve the debate, or could this help reconcile the problems you've mentioned?
Thanks very much. I think it's important to recognize, which we've already talked about today, the interconnectedness of conflicts in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, with the EU, and how these conflicts are not just a disaster for human security, but also directly threaten EU prosperity and national security, and they, you know, they disrupt trade routes, they stunt national and regional growth, they force millions of people to leave their homes to unstable neighbours and also to make the treacherous journey to the EU. So these issues are interconnected. I think there is a danger in seeing conflicts in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, as through the lens of Global Gateway or through the lens of the EU's geopolitical rivalries. We've talked a lot today about the need to address conflict drivers that are very local. And so it might be interesting. Another interesting example that I heard during the interviews for the briefing that you have in front of you was from an NGO that received funding to run a mediation effort in Somalia when there was suddenly an opening for peace. And when I spoke to the NGO, they said that the turnaround for the funding was very quick, but the reason that it was effective was because they knew who to fund and what to fund and what an effective intervention based on a knowledge of the conflict drivers would look like. If we're looking at countries like Somalia in terms of investment and infrastructure and geopolitical competition, I'm not sure we'll be able to see what those conflict drivers are or know what to do when they emerge. I think it's great to see that Global Gateway is being conflict sensitive, but the focus is still investment and infrastructure. It's not conflict drivers, and so there's always going to be a limit to how much we can fit those drivers into a Global Gateway lens.
Thank you very much. I think I wanted to ask Melissa about conflict analysis, so this is a great segue. And of course, if Eva and or John have things to add, they're more than welcome to. The only logistical challenge is passing the mic. So this morning, you know, there was a question, I think it was from Search for Common Ground's team about who's the final decision maker, if an investment needs to be stopped or okay, back to the basics. The conflict analysis obligation, if I'm not mistaken, applies to when you want to unlock EU NDC Europe, Global Europe funding. But as we also said this morning, the Global Gateway is more than just this fund. There's additional funds from member states, other members of Team Europe, also the private sector. So there are two questions in one. One, what is the level of coordination on conflict analysis with Team Europe and with the private sector? And I also want to ask, because this morning we also talked about these new critical raw materials agreements and bilateral political partnerships with partners. The EU is concluding many of these agreements, which are not necessarily legally binding, but a good basis for working with partners. And I wanted to ask if conflict analysis, at what stage does it intervene, if any time, in preparing these agreements? I believe these questions also came up during Sikala's hearing, because they are some sort of political promise, but the conflict analysis and the legal obligations of the EU are also part of this. Sorry for the very long question. Please.
No, but they're also very pertinent questions. So I'm glad to be able to give a first shot. And then if anyone else wants to complement, I'll be happy to do the phone delivery, the microphone delivery over there. But just to begin with, yes, the conflict analysis has become mandatory, legally binding with the NDK regulation, but it doesn't date from there. It actually dates, and it has its roots in the integrated approach of 2017 with the issues paper first, and 2018, and that's how it's, for me, extended to the member states, because there were council conclusions in 2018. And what that puts, I think there are two very important points in the integrated approach philosophy. First, it says that it should culminate in human security. So that's our endpoint. That is, whatever we do with all our EU instruments, it should culminate in more human security. Then the second one is to make the conflict analysis, the joint analysis, as a starting point. And even though we have this in but out principle for our colleagues from DG ECO, they're also part of this analysis. So when it comes to this idea of fragility strategy, let's all come together and have this joint analysis, it's actually there. The principles are there. They're already embedded in the integrated approach. When it comes to how this then works, because of course, as it became mandatory since 2021 and actually 2022, the machine started really working because it also took some time to set it up. There's been 60 conflict analyses conducted. So I think if you take the fragility list of the OECD, there's a good match, I would say, in terms of the scope that we're actually reaching. But that's the conflict analysis, so that's one part. And then the analysis is being used and needs to be adapted specifically to different contexts that we're applying. Actually, that conflict analysis, even though it comes from NDK Global Europe, is even used in our CSDP missions, to inform our CSDP missions. So that's actually quite a, I think, a major development that sometimes we tend to forget. But conflict analysis is not necessarily conflict sensitivity assessment. So that's the next step that we take into that process. So you have the conflict analysis that is conducted, and I think that's a major point in country. So we're doing that from the headquarters. We're providing the support in terms of the methodology, but the ones that are really running it is our colleagues in the delegations. And for reasons perhaps of conflict sensitivity again, it's not necessarily advertised to everyone that we're conducting a conflict analysis in country, but usually during those times we're also meeting with civil society actors, obviously the heads of mission or heads of cooperation of our member states, and that's the Team Europe dimension to it, are part of this process. And then that conflict analysis is actually being used by our FPI colleagues, by our INPA, NEAR colleagues, when they actually run a conflict sensitivity assessment. And that is how they take that to apply it to specific projects, including Global Gateway. So I think Luc kind of alluded to it this morning when he mentioned the Lobito corridor, saying, yeah, we haven't actually done it, even though there's been discussions about it. The reason why is because this assessment is still ongoing. And in the meantime, under the resilience part of the rapid response pillar, DG INPA has been investing in the same region a project which is actually quite, considering I'm a bit jealous when it comes to the thematic program, because we have for a year a 40 million budget, and this for DRC alone, Eastern DRC alone, the project was 43 million project. But with that being said, it means that they're actually investing the resources that are necessary to bring along the communities and looking into that assessment and preparing the grounds perhaps for the Global Gateway to go ahead. Then who pulls the plug? Of course, that is a trickier question, but I can only tell you, at least at the technical level, the way that this will go forward is usually we would have a strategic steering committee meeting of our geographic colleagues that are coming up with, for instance, the Global Gateway proposal, and then us, the thematic colleagues that are conducting or looking at it from the peace lens, would be invited to actually review this on the basis of the conflict analysis that has been produced. And then, if they have not taken into account our comments, we can get another shot at the quality review mechanism, the meetings that we have at the inter-service level. And then all that, after we have at least the EU inter-service level understanding, goes again, there's another scrutiny through our member states. So I think we have quite a multi-layered system, but this is the kitchen work that I'm telling you. Of course, the politic dynamics are there, so I will not also deny that. But at least at the technical level, I think we have put in place some steps. When it comes to the timing issue, I think that has been a challenge in this round because the conflict analysis had to be run a bit in parallel as the programming was going on. So we came up with wonderful recommendations, but perhaps a bit late to really influence. And I hope in this new multi-annual financial framework, we'll have a better base to actually influence that. And then another pet project of mine that I'm very sensitive to, you mentioned the local dimension. And of course, in these volatile contexts, having a conflict analysis, a one-time analysis is insufficient. We need to definitely invest in ensuring that this is regularly being updated so that we can really ensure that conflict sensitivity, because sometimes very good intentions and the conflict analysis can actually even be harmful in itself, because if the dynamics on the ground have shifted, and I've seen that in a number of contexts. So being aware that resource needs to be invested into that is also a recognition that we need to have in place. And more importantly, as we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about maybe long-term financing it. But I think for me, flexibility also means being able to adapt the ongoing programs. And that, I think, is probably the harder part for the EU institutional architecture.
Thank you. That was quite comprehensive. I'm sure your colleagues will agree. And I might need a flow chart for this internal kitchen. I will quickly get maybe Leonard's reaction, who I'm sure has comments on conflict assessment methodology. And I want to ask what the immediate next steps in adopting peace-positive investment with Global Gateway, what that would look like. For example, they were mentioning the Lobito corridor. For this kind of assessment stage project, when would an organization like yours like to be involved? Thank you. And then we'll move to the floor for a Q&A.
Thank you, Fanny, and thank you for the different comments and questions. I will answer your question in a second, but I want to say a quick word on the question of resources, because we heard a lot about how resources are shrinking, how we have less funding available for the kind of work we're doing. But I think it's also a question on what are we spending the existing resources on. We heard this morning from Hannah Neumann that the plan is to spend 500 billion on defense in the EU. If you compare that to what is spent annually on peace ODA, that's 5 billion. So we spend 1% on peace compared to what the EU alone wants to spend on defense. So it's also a question of prioritization. Then what Hilde mentioned as well, that humanitarian needs and funding for humanitarian action is going up. We had the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. We had the Sustaining Peace resolutions, and there was a call for ending needs. Yet, what we're once again doing is treating symptoms rather than the root causes that actually cause the funding needs of humanitarian aid to go up. I mentioned the climate financing and how so much money is unallocated and is not being spent. Of the climate financing, only 3% goes to the least developed countries, and 2% or even less goes to fragile countries. And we talk a lot about how the EU and other actors need to take more risk, but we talk very little about how we actually decrease the risk that exists. And again, this is where peace building work comes in and can play an important part. And then last example on food and food storage. In the Horn of Africa, around 40% of the food is lost post-harvest. And this is roughly equal to the amount of food aid we spend every year in the Horn of Africa. So again, it's a question of how do we spend resources. And this has to do with topics that are very pertinent to the Global Gateway. Transport, climate, we have droughts, floods. But again, it also links to peace building, because the way that local farmers are organized or not organized, who they're selling their crops to, who they trust or distrust, all of those factors impact how much food is lost in that region and in other regions. So right now we're looking with FAO, we're looking at how the case of food storage can be one of those examples where a global gateway type of investment critically needs a peace building component to actually be able to work. And this is maybe also what I will say on what are the steps and how do we move from, let's say, analysis to action. It's not only a question about having the conflict analysis and the conflict sensitivity assessment that is important, but that's the basis. Then it's also a question of really integrating the peace building work into the investment projects that are happening across the sectors and across the countries, because I think there's a misconception that this type of conflict sensitivity, peace responsiveness, and peace building work is only really relevant to fragile contexts. It's actually relevant almost anywhere. I think it was Inge who mentioned this morning, if you want to build a windmill in Belgium or in Germany, all of a sudden you have citizens organizing, petitions coming up, there are legal challenges, there are new bird species discovered that need to be protected. So even in our countries, we face those challenges which delay investments, but the difference is that here we have political stability, we have the regulatory frameworks that you often don't have in other countries. So that's why there this is even more pertinent. But conflict sensitivity, peace responsiveness, and peace positive investments are fundamental in all countries where the Global Gateway will and is engaging.
Amen. And sorry, I'm not religious, but that seemed fitting. And apologies, I've held the opportunity to ask questions for so long, and now I would like to give the audience a chance. If we could collect 2 or 3 questions at once, that would be ideal. And please briefly introduce yourself. And I think we have a thanks. Thanks, Lucia. If anyone else is okay, then we'll start with you. Sorry, I think there's a little button.
Is that better? Yes.
Perfect.
Hi. Sorry, Derval O'Callaghan from the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office. Thank you all for your contributions and for the excellent report that we're speaking about today. My question is a bit linked to that. So it comes out in the report, this gap between rapid response funding and longer term funding, and a lot of EPLO's member organizations struggle with this. As Eva mentioned, this logic is built into the NDICI regulation. It should be working, but it isn't. So does this come down to perhaps a difference in organizational cultures within the EU institutions? Are people not speaking the same language? If we think about the context of the next MFF, if whatever the successor to the NDICI is, if it contains the same logic, but we still can't overcome these internal issues within the House, are we going to get any further in the next 7-year period? Thank you.
Thank you. And before we have our response, would anyone like to put a question forward? Yes, here.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the contribution. My name is Anna Penfrat and I work for Nonviolent Peace Force, but you've heard that before, sorry. Thank you very, very much for the points and also for the examples from INPA or from Leo in Cameroon and Ghana. What can we learn from those examples? I'm wondering in terms of the resources that are needed to have all those different steps in place so that everything goes as planned. It would be fantastic to hear from you in terms of human resources at the EU level, for instance, that are needed for that. My assumption is that with what Hilde mentioned with the decreasing in resources at EU level, not only in terms of funding being used externally, but also in terms of staffing, we see more and more the EU and other donors wanting to sign bigger and bigger contracts because it's less paperwork and internal bureaucracy, and they just don't have enough resources. It's also a matter of expertise of the EU colleagues, and very often for those type of projects to work, it comes down to an individual or a few individuals who are working well together and making it work. how do we incentivize this type of cooperation? It would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and also on the big contracts. If the EU is using more intermediaries to fund this type of project for the Global Gateway or outside, what would be the necessary conditions to make sure that this still supports locally led peace-building initiatives? So that's my first question. And the second is on fragility. So we have this project of new approaches to fragility. The UNDP colleague in the first panel mentioned that UNDP prefers to talk about fragile contexts than fragile countries. And fragility is quite a loaded term. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on potential alternative or how to look at this. Thanks.
Thank you. Please, anyone who would like to start? Maybe okay, Melis. Oh, did your microphone disappear?
If I take the EPLO question first, for me that brings me a bit to what I had in mind in my concluding remarks. So do we need actually a new framework? Because everyone is talking about this fragility approach, a new integrated approach for fragility. We have that in place. That's not where we have the gap. It's been 6 years. I've been in the team, getting smaller, by the way, talking about human resources, working on the implementation of the integrated approach. One of the success stories, or one of the ways of making sure that we all start speaking the same language or see things collectively that I have experienced, is that when we have these collective efforts that we call within the EU, in our jargon, a political framework for a crisis approach. And that doesn't necessarily need to be actually at national level. It can actually be at regional level, taking into account in this more fluid concept of that the borderlines of the conflict does not actually finish at the national borders. And it can be very localized as well. So we've done that quite a few years ago for Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, bringing together all the actors. And over there, indeed, we cannot change that. We have different institutional cultures. We're looking at things from a different way. Even the way that we speak about the integrated approach or that we interpret it is different. It's been 6 years that I'm giving actually training, including to our colleagues that are in missions, so that they can actually understand the Commission language and the EU language that we're using, because these are cultural gaps that we need to fill. Part of the challenge of the integrated approach, if you read the document, it also clearly says that there is no real coordination mandate. So we're respecting each institution's own mandate and legal framework, which is good in a sense that therefore everyone is an equal partner coming around, and it's really, we're all speaking, there's no one over another. Yet it's also a challenge in making sure that you're bringing the puzzle together in a way that is coherent and cohesive. So for me, the challenge is at the operational level, and when it comes to resources, it's not even at the headquarters, even though we see here that we're all stretched as well, but at the level of our delegations. So our colleagues are receiving all these new guidelines, including, by the way, we already had some guidelines on the HTP nexus and what the peace element means with the beginning of the financial framework as part of the NDK programming guidelines. But for them to decipher that and to really apply it at the local level, and being able to cope with not only the challenge that I mentioned. Of course, it's easy for me sitting here to say a once in a time conflict analysis is not enough, but this comes on top of course, their daily work as well, to be able to adapt that analysis and to take that into account when they're doing the programming. And then the programming cycle, so we mentioned indeed the accountability, or I think MEP Newman really put that emphasis on it, the accountability, and that's why we need to reach certain targets, etc. which are great, but then the more we have also targets and minimum levels that are needed to be reached, the less actually flexible and adaptable we can become, which means that colleagues therefore tend, and it's understandable, to reach those targets, stick to the initial programming process, which is not in itself always, in that sense, peace responsive. So that's also one of the clear challenges that we have. Then you have to remind me what the fragility. So the way that I see when it comes to the fragility debate, I would argue that as we define the integrated approach, responding all the way from conflict prevention to resilience, in any case, it covers fragility. So I wonder, indeed, what would be the added value of yet again engaging in a process of defining that, instead of fixing what we know are the challenges at the operational level of making different type of instruments or funding lines work together and bridging that gap. So that would be my main worry when, good intentions, yes, we need this fragility approach, but the issue is not the policy framework. The issue is what is blocking it, and maybe that's a question that we should all ask ourselves before we start engaging into yet another cycle of policy debates and conceptual, where, I'm part of the team that is also developing all these concepts. So usually our delegation colleagues are like, okay, don't send us yet another policy document because we are already having trouble in implementing what we have at hand. So just wanted to flag that.
Thanks. Abigail, concisely, if possible.
Don't worry, I can also hand the floor over. John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just actually wanted to maybe add to Melissa's point, and I was interested in what you said about, say, perhaps what makes these projects work in a fragile context. I thought that a critique we regularly get is that our projects are too slow to be implemented. We should be moving faster. We should be implementing and delivering quicker. But a counterpoint to that, in many respects, is that in order to develop and deliver a project effectively in a fragile context, it's very important to engage the local communities, civil society, think tanks, all of these other actors, to ensure that the impact that we want to have is effective. So I think realistically, something that really makes these projects work is engaging the experts, engaging the people that are working in that context, so we can actually deliver the most effective project possible. I wanted to maybe gesture towards some structures that the EU has developed recently in terms of engaging, say, think tanks, civil society, local authorities. In last year, we launched the Global Gateway Civil Society platform, advisory platform. So that is a vehicle to have your input, to have other organizations input globally, to see how Global Gateway can work more effectively. I also wanted to mention that next week, you might know the Policy Forum for Development in Africa, and we're going to have our regional Africa meeting, and one of the key areas that we're going to talk about is peace security. So there are forums to talk about these things and talk about the projects that how we can develop them in the most effective way possible. So I think what makes them work is really engaging civil society actors in on these topics, so we can really listen to them and develop the projects the best way possible.
Thanks, John, also for mentioning the dialogue platform, of which CEPS is a member. We would only be happy for the platform to be even more active. That would be great. And unless, of course, I don't want to rob Eva of the possibility of giving her opinion. And after Eva, if our civil society members of the panel would have a short concluding statement, be able to give a concise answer, I would really like to hear that. Thank you. Eva, please.
Okay, now I will be very quick. To reply to the question from Eplo, because it was very specific on crisis response and why we find ourselves in the situation that we are. There are many that I can maybe not say aloud, but one of them is the fact that we are sometimes forced to do things that are not necessarily our primary nature because the needs are there. So we have sometimes this feeling that if we don't do it, then nobody will do it. And then, you know, and then what? So there is a lot to be learned in terms of coordination, absolutely. We take it on us. But then this links very nicely to your second question. Are we going to be in the same situation in the next MFF? And the answer is maybe. As sad as it sounds, but it will all depend on higher level political dynamics. So, sorry to be very blunt.
Sobering. Maybe Abigail, you would like to?
I'm sorry, I know we're pressed for time, but I just wanted to flag that in the report it was very pessimistic, and we now hope to do a second report trying to map how some of these issues can be fixed. So please consider this part of a conversation where we'd love to carry on engaging.
No, maybe I want to close off with one final thought. We often go around in circles about like how can we get certain parts of the European Union infrastructure architecture more interested in staying engaged in fragile countries, right? That's something that a lot of us think about day to day, day and night sometimes. And it often comes down to this dichotomy between it needs to be based on our values or it needs to be based on the EU self-interest. I would add that there's a third layer to that, and that is how is the EU being perceived globally and what's our reputation globally. If the EU wants to continue and increasingly be a geopolitical actor and have access and influence in many countries, but also in regional and global platforms, I really think it comes down to how credible does the EU show up in some of these fragile places, and what does it mean to disengage, and what does it mean to no longer talk with people that we don't like talking to? How does that influence the EU's capacity to really be a global actor? I'll now conclude with that.
I would like maybe to respond to Anna's questions on the capacities and the resources that are needed. So of course, the EU needs the staff expertise in the delegations, especially on peace and conflict. But I think what is important there is that it's not siloed, but actually integrated in the overall work. Oftentimes we have the tendency to have a gender advisor, climate advisor, conflict advisor, and they are the ones responsible for the work. But actually those kind of issues are cross-cutting and need to be integrated across all the work that the EU is doing. In terms of financial resources, I mentioned the 1 million peace building work in the Ghana solar power plant. So it shows that sometimes the financial resources needed are actually not even that high, but it's important that they're built in very deliberately and that peace is thought through from the beginning in a deliberate way. Of course, sometimes depending on the project, it can be more expensive. So one example is the Blue Peace Initiative in the Gambia River Basin, which is 4 countries, the Gambia, Senegal, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. And they are now the UN Capital Development Fund actually for several years negotiated transboundary water agreements between those 4 countries, but also looked at how then the hydro power plant and the agricultural work would benefit farmers, local communities, and so on. So a bit the peace finance approach I was describing. And they will launch next year, if everything goes well, the first Blue Peace bond. And this bond, it complies with the peace finance standards that I was mentioning. But it will be 2 billion. So of course, for a 2 billion bond, you need a significant political and financial investment before to make that happen. So it depends a bit very quickly on fragility and do we need a new concept. I mean, I think there are 2 answers to that. If it gives new political attention to the importance of peace and the work we're talking about here, then it can be something positive. If it's just takes away attention from actually putting this work into practice, which is, as Melis said, already very well outlined in other policy papers, then it's maybe not necessary. So I would say it depends. In general, I think the the framing matters. And people or partner countries like to be called fragile. So that's why other terms like, for example, resilience, you can look at many of the same factors in the country, but from a much more positive framing, and that's oftentimes opens doors both for local peace building work as well as for political engagement. And the same on conflict sensitivity. We at Interpeace, we've been talking for a couple of years now more about peace responsiveness, because we really want to underline that it's not enough anymore to just not do any harm or be conflict sensitive, but really that all actors engaged in the humanitarian and development space and the finance space, I would add, need to see how they can deliberately contribute to peace.
Thank you, and thank you all for your great contributions. I think we just started peeling the layers of this very complex issue. It's been a pleasure, and yes, now I will be happy to hand over the stage to Philipp Rothman, who is the director of the GPPI in Berlin, for our final act. But first, a round of applause for the panel, the respondents, and everyone. Thanks. And Jeren, could you please come back to the stage, please?
Once again, technical, everybody goes through the same steps of learning here. You have been promised to get out of here in 3 minutes, I think. That's a challenge for us, but we'll try to be very, very fast. My name is Philipp Rothman. I'm a director of the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, in Germany, and we're co-hosting this today with SEPS. Thanks very much for the excellent cooperation. We wanted to very briefly collect a few concluding thoughts from the two panels and the overlap between them, to help you bring all the different thoughts together before we send you off into this wonderful November day. Jaren, would you like to start with maybe what do you think are the kind of the key takeaways from the first round of discussion?
So thank you. These two panels were indeed very complementary. I came to the first panel coming from the task force. The first panel I had one set of duality in mind regarding Global Gateway, and now I'm leaving with two sets of duality after listening to the second panel. So great, even better, right? So these two dualities, as I understand from the first panel primarily, but also listening to the second one, the first one is the one between sustainable development and competitiveness, economic competitiveness as defined in the Open Strategic Autonomy and all the relevant documents. And to reconcile these two, development and competitiveness, there seems to be a consensus among the decision makers that we need to redefine development assistance as development through investments, so that the partner countries can scale up in the value chains, global value chains that the EU is a part of. Well, that brings us to the second duality, as I understand, flexibility, as commonly mentioned in the second panel, to mobilize the private sector. Because there was an example how the climate finance doesn't go to fragile contexts. So development through investments, infrastructure investment is easier said than done, basically, right? But then flexibility to mobilize private sector comes with its inherent contradiction, which is letting go of the accountability, or not letting go of the accountability, of course. And here we've heard a lot of examples in the second panel, and that helped me to recall other instances that I heard in the many global gateway debates, heated debates I've been a part of in the recent weeks. Like, for example, one of the flagship projects in Kenya trying to bring internet to schools that turns out to not have electricity in the first place. Hence goes the accountability. So I understand that's in transitionary periods. And what we understand from the first panel, and that's one of the main takeaways, that Global Gateway has an approach of first deciding case by case, leaving room for trial and error, learning from the best practice, and then hopefully as a second phase, building up generalizable regulations. And I'm here referring back to Scott's point of how the partner countries would like to actually take part in the forming of the regulations instead of just being subjected to them. So in order to reach that point, Global Gateway's current approach is seemingly very bottom-up, which is a good thing. But I think the questions and comments from the floor in the first panel and the second panel in particular shows us the need to bring in stakeholders and professionals, both from the partner countries, both from the EU and the partner countries and third parties into the discussion to make the discussion more inclusive and expand the toolbox. And I understand, I see the point of relying on the already existing toolbox without inventing the wheel again and again, but expanding the toolbox in an inclusive and holistic way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we need to be a little bit cognizant of people's time, Fanny.
And I'm the culprit. Thank you. So I'm still digesting, but I wanted to maybe come back on, and there are many things that were touched upon, on two things. One is that Global Gateway needs to be peace responsive everywhere, not just in the 37 designated fragile and conflict-affected situations, I think from the World Bank definition. The other is something that came around the end of the panel on the political momentum of integrating this peace-building approach to Global Gateway. So it was, I think, the point on maybe we don't need additional guidelines because there's already so many mechanisms and work in place. But can it bring political attention and incentive to integrate long-term peace building in the Global Gateway? I think this is interesting because, I mean, if somebody already mentioned the Draghi report in the first panel, but not in the second, because we're also among people who would like to see, beyond this in the complexity. And I think it was early this morning that somebody said the Draghi report type of discourse was maybe before the prerogative of member states to maybe exaggerate and say, well, okay, not who cares about peace, but let us look at the economic competitiveness first for Europe, and then we'll adapt. I think in this debate will be a very important one, in which the European Parliament will probably have a strong role, not necessarily as an ally or a foe, because that's very much depends on power balances and sensibility. But I think this political attention can be brought if we talk more about the reputational aspects for the European Union of addressing their role as a peace and security actor in the world, and also on the long-term costs of the possible backlash of not addressing this. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, to maybe leave you with from my end also 3 observations. I think the first one, the money has been shrinking and it will shrink further for the next MFF, so we need to have a very realistic approach. And I think despite all the talk and a lot of mentions of prioritization today, we've also heard a lot of, to be honest, different suggestions of how to prioritize. So the devil is in the details. Point 2, I think we did here two different directions that are both important. One is basically making Global Gateway more peace sensitive and more peacenik. But I think if we're honest, that means going along with the priorities of the investment logic, of the connectivity logic first, right? Go to the solar park, and because the solar park is there for the solar park reasons, and then look at basically what are the peace and conflict problems around that, versus acknowledging that this approach, even if it is properly implemented everywhere, will also still leave a major gap in terms of particular spaces, be they in the same countries, be they in different countries, and particular conflict risks where under conditions of massive resource constraints of our limited funding and limited money and political attention, we are being forced, for all the reasons, from interests through values and reputation, to look at what are the most value added, the best targeted investments for peace in these areas, and they might often not be the solar park, right? So there might be other kind of very hands-on peace, stability, security focused investments needed, for which there are currently very practical hurdles in the budget that need to be dealt with. Point three is the solution to this a fragility strategy? I think we don't know. I think Leo put it well. It depends on what's in it. If it does kind of try to fill that funding gap and incentivize Global Gateway to be more kind of peace sensitive, the answer could be yes. We've gone through a few cycles of using the fragility term as well as its competitors in the last 15 years or so. I think we're all a little bit out of very smart new label ideas, but we'll have to see what the new commission will come up with in terms of the political force and direction of this idea. With that, once again, thank you very, very much to everyone who spent this morning with us here in the room or online. Thank you very much to SEP's colleagues for the collaboration and for bringing this together, and to all the speakers from the task force and the various other the parts of the European Union system. Hannah Neumann this morning for kicking us off, and do enjoy the rest of your day if you're not joining us at 1 p.m. for the invitation-only lunch, which for those participants who are participating, that would be on the second floor in the boardroom after a short break. Thank you very much and goodbye.